Ladies, gentlemen, and deities of all ages, welcome back to another video. I am super excited to announce that I have a special guest on me for this collab for a tier list. It's going to be a two-part collab, so check out the other video. These are dropping at the same time. One of them is a character video, and the other is a classes video, but I'm very excited to introduce the super nice and talented Titanium Legman. How you doing?
Hello. Doing very well. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. I've been very excited to work with you on this stuff. I've been seeing your stuff for a while, so it's great to have two SRPG nuts put their heads together and try and make somewhat of a tier list. These are always a shit show when I do them, and people always disagree because it's almost impossible to bring two opinions together and be like, okay, well, let's go halfway. So I'm sure this is going to be brilliant and definitive forever and ever and ever. Of course, it's not. But guys, this is all just for fun and sort of early game thoughts that we think about having done our first 1.5 playthroughs or so. Yeah, what do you think?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely incorrect. This is going to be 100% cutthroat, and I'm coming for you. So your opinions are wrong and invalid, and so is everyone else's in chat. In the comments, I should say. So I encourage everyone in the comments to tell me that I'm wrong because you actually are wrong. And I know there's at least a couple of characters in here, having seen your content, that we are going to have some strong differing opinions on, so I'm very excited to argue about that.
Well, if we agreed on everything, I think that would be extremely boring and no one would want to watch. So I think that's what makes the best content, is the fact that we have disagreements and arguments, and we'll yell at each other in a smart way, as SRPG fans tend to do.
We're bringing the flame wars of game facts back to life live in 2025. Let's go.
Dude, don't you and I know it, man.
Yeah, we do. Oh, man. All right, so what do we have going on here then? We got some tiers, we got some characters.
Yeah, so we're just going to do the standard S to D, and we can go ahead and start off with Gwyn. So Gwyn is our main character, and for anyone who's seen my recruitable units breakdown, all of the information that we're going to talk about can be found there, but we'll gloss over some points of it. But I'll let you go first, Legman. What do you think?
I mean, Gwyn is definitely a very strong character. Like, you can run her, in my experience, in pretty much any of the classes that are available to her in the what I call the warrior tree. I don't think she's the best character around, partially because the warrior tree is a little limited, but I don't think you can really go wrong with her. Having the ability to get block on kills, having the ability to just deal extra damage to secure those skills, or those kills, I should say. It's a very good, balanced, all-around skill set, so I would say she's probably an A-tier character. You know, she's not like the Ellie Woods of old where you just feel bad trying to use her. You know, she actually feels like a powerful member of the team. I like her. I
agree, and I think Gwyn has this tendency to snowball if you put her in sort of... I mean, it depends on what class you go with her, right? Mm-hmm. But if you put her in, let's say, the first warrior class, the 1/4 champion. Why am I blanking on these?
Gallant?
I should know these by heart. Gallant, yeah. And she gets that block on kills.
Yeah.
You need her to snowball. But for me, at least in Demonic, I found that it's actually kind of hard to get her off the floor because her growths tend to be so well-rounded that she's not really specialized in one area over the other. And so she tends to somewhat float in the middle of the pack, at least for me. And again, like you said, because the classes are, I don't want to say bad, but they're a little bit more mediocre for the warrior tree, at least in tier 2. She struggles a little bit in the mid-game until she reaches the end game. I think as a Seeker and as a Gallant, she's actually pretty good. I struggle with the Nightblade class a little bit. I don't know why. I feel like it might just be a skill issue. But I would agree she would probably be in like maybe a B tier for me or a low A. It'll depend on how the rest of this tier list goes. But I feel like, you know, we can start her off in the A tier or the B tier and then go from there and reshape. What do you think?
I think bottom of A is probably pretty good, kind of like the Gatekeeper. Like, you have to be better than Gwyn to really be at the top of A tier, you know? So I think she can kind of be the person you have to beat to really break it into the all-times. And I do agree as well, like, Nightblade in particular is definitely a rough class for her. I think just because she really wants that speed to be able to make the most of what Nightblade has to offer, and she just doesn't have it. The number of times I've seen Gwyn double is pretty low across one full playthrough and I think 3 other half playthroughs already thus far. It just doesn't happen. So I think bottom of A for now is definitely a good option. We could always bump her down if we feel we need to.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you brought up the speed thing, because in Demonic, the speed thresholds are actually so incredibly high that even if she was in the Nightblade class, like, most Nightblades are not going to double unless they've got some buffs stacked up and stuff like that. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. She would. I think I like that Gatekeeper analogy. We can keep her in the bottom of A for now.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
All right. Let's talk about Riordan. So I have mixed opinions on this guy because he's so good in the quick draw class, but I started him out in Tamer because I wanted those big one-shots. But while I'm doing my demonic playthrough right now, quick draw doesn't really double, and so I find that I'm missing those big Tamer one-shots, and Riordan actually ended up benched for me.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah, simply because he just wasn't doubling. His unique ability wasn't doing as much damage as I would have liked it to do, and other characters like Zuhair were out damaging him, which I was surprised about, at least from a utility perspective.
Yeah, wow.
But even when I had him in Tamer, it felt like he was tanky enough to tank, but only at the end game, and for the first, I want to say third of the game, he struggled until he got into his tier 3. And so I would be more inclined to put him in a very average, sort of middling B-tier side, simply because of the choices I made. I think on Deity, if you put him into Quick Draw, he's probably a phenomenal unit, but I think on Demonic, he gets held back by the fact that he wants to be that speed demon that does high damage, and he just isn't there yet.
Yeah, I definitely hear that, and I had that exact experience. I put Riordan directly into Quick Draw on Deity, and he was definitely a monster. He didn't double as much as you would like for Quick Draw, but the single target damage was just so on point, especially with Weapon Master and everything, or Weapon Expert or whatever the exact phrasing is on it. He does have extremely high damage possibilities, especially with Command Wolf, things like that, but he's absolutely very class dependent. So I think that if anything, Riordan is probably best in Quick Draw or Ranger, and in those he does do a very, very good job. I've used him in both, and he's always been satisfactory for me. I'm actually using him in Ranger on Demonic right now, and he's one of my best tanks, so it's pretty nice. But I really think he just wishes that he had access to the Warrior tree so he could get Seeker. I think Seeker would be the absolute best class for him. So.
And I think, I'm glad you brought up the Ranger part, because I think one of the things on Demonic is that tanks struggle. It very quickly ramps up the amount of damage, and with his very low base speed growth and the almost negligible extra speed that you get from Ranger, he's going to be getting doubled a lot, and even, 8 times 2 will stack up fairly quickly, even with his base high HP growth. You're getting chunked by a lot of enemies all at once in Demonic that I feel like tanks are kind of inconsistent.
It could definitely be pretty rough. That's what I like about Ranger form specifically, though, because you get Shield Stance. So you get that big, heavy block trigger when you drop below half health. And I've found that allows him to tank enemy waves on turns that otherwise and other characters probably wouldn't be able to do, because he has that HP, because he has surprisingly decent defenses for what is ostensibly an archer. So it can be a little bit of a game of chicken to make sure that he actually lives long enough, but he's able to do it where other characters can't. That said, I definitely don't think he rises above B. If Gwyn is our gatekeeper, I don't think that he beats Gwyn in terms of getting into A tier, so I'm happy with B.
Damn, the sibling rivalry. He can't beat the older sister. He's just forever the middle child syndrome, unfortunately.
Oh, little bro, it's unfortunate, but just don't step to it, man. It's not worth it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Lil Bro, it's time to talk about Arthur. So I'll let you start this one out.
I mean, Lil Bro is actually Big Bro in terms of the stats. Arthur is undeniably an S-tier character, and I will fight anyone who tries to tell me otherwise. Arthur is so
glad you said
strong.
That. I'm so glad you said that, but I'll let you continue.
Well, I mean, dude, all you have to do is look at Luna Reeve. Reeve is so stupid in the best way. Yes, every single ability I use in a game that's focused on ability usage is going to make my unique personal ability stronger. The direct damage abilities that are already some of the most busted things about the game, and I can just have, unilaterally the most powerful one in terms of damage per mana spent, and just nuke things no matter what class I'm in. It doesn't matter if I'm support. It doesn't matter if I'm offense. I will just destroy stuff, and that's Arthur. He's phenomenal. And then you get extra mana regen on top of it. Say less. He's S tier. Just put him there. It's fine.
Oh, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do that even before I start talking. But yeah, he is absolutely S tier, and I think that mage class tree is just such a nice switchblade of different things. I mean, he's got access. He can be whatever he wants to be, because Arthur also has that monstrous mastery growth. He starts with 40% base mastery growth. And if you go down sort of the Cosmician Geomancer class, like that gets up to 80%. My endgame Arthur had like 70 mastery. It's disgusting how much mastery he had. My meteors that I was dropping were doing like 125 damage.
Woo! Let's go. Nice.
I know. It is crazy. And then if you get that ring that makes it do splash damage 50% to enemies that are right next to it, like you're doing 125 to 1 and you're doing 62 damage to everything around it. Oh, it's beautiful. And honestly, I didn't really use Lunar Reeve much in my Deity playthrough. Like he was mostly a Star Surge, Moonlight, and then he turned into sort of the Cosmician with Meteor doing the nuking. So I underappreciated Lunar Reeve. But on my Demonic playthrough, the further in you get to a map and the less time you have to clear out the waves, the better he is getting. And especially if you take sort of the mana discount on Lunar Reeve with the ability upgrades and his Celestial Affinity, like you said, generating the mana faster, he just snowballs very quickly from, not even very quickly, he's like out the gate broken from chapter 1 simply because of Lunar Reeve. Like he is your carry. And I was so shocked at how good he was so early.
It was just guaranteed damage, right? Like,
you're
not worried about stats. You're not worried about anything. It's like, how many abilities have I used? What enemy needs to die? Lunar Reeve be upon ye. It's just, you can look at something and it explodes. And especially on Demonic, that is a very, very rare tool to have. So being the guy that can do that immediately puts him above everybody else, at least that we've talked about thus far.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think he is an easy S tier. Easy S tier.
Easy.
All right, let's move on to my favorite unit in the game. This is no secret. I have been ranting and raving and gushing about the beautiful Cassandra ever since the game launched. She was my best unit by far and away, incomparable in Deity. And surprisingly, in Demonic, while she doesn't do as well as she does in Deity because of the stat thresholds, she's not as consistently doubling, but her speed is high enough, especially in the Ritualist class, which has been sort of my bread and butter for carry unit. If you buff her with, say, a Valeria special or anyone that can increase your speed, she does have enough to double, especially if you give her that ring that I am blanking on right now for the name.
I know the one you're talking about too, but same thing.
The bloodied ring.
Yes,
the bloodied ring. That gives you 8% to your advanced stats. She will easily get +3 to +4 in the early game, and her HP growth is very high, so she will hit that cap and get those 8. But even then, in Demonic, unfortunately, she has just not been as strong, especially against some of the physical units that she has been unable to double without buffs. And because of that lack of sustainability, at least until the mid-game, I'm only up to Chapter 12, but without all of the stat boosters that we were able to give her, I can't in good conscience put her in S tier. I think she definitely goes above Gwyn in the A tier, and she's gotten a good few amount of MVPs for me, but I think she will just miss that S tier and go with maybe the top of A.
I think I would agree with that assessment, absolutely. You can absolutely put her there. I won't argue with that. I think it's a good draw. She's in what I call the Druid class tree, and it's a very, very good class tree. You have a lot of great options there, and she can fit a good amount of them. Definitely does not want to be a Juggernaut, which, funny enough, is what I used her in during my Deity playthrough, and it worked, but it wasn't great. But, I mean, yeah, stuff like Ritualist is phenomenal. Tideseeker, or whatever the proper terminology is there. Also a very good option for her, like, there are good ways that you can use Cassandra, and she's pretty much happy in all of them, but especially once you get into Ritualist, it gets gross. The issue is if you're trying to use her as some sort of like sustain tank and everything, which Ritualist does like to do, you, as you were saying, need that speed to be able to proc multiple heals off of your attacks on bleeding enemies. And it's hard to make that happen on Demonic, man. And it's not like this tier list is exclusively for Demonic, but it is something to consider for sure. So... she's not just unequivocally always going to be useful the way Arthur is, and I think that's a pretty good bar to try to reach to hit S tier. So I think A is definitely good. I do think personally that there are other better druids that we'll talk about later, in my personal opinion. But she's definitely a very strong option, no doubt.
I mean, you know, it's interesting you brought up the Waveseer class. I actually completely overlooked that, but I think any unit that you can put in the Waveseer Tidecaller class is going to be S tier. I think just by virtue of the utility, having access to that immediately makes you S tier, regardless of your growths and personal skills and whatever. Some do it better than other, but I mean, her skill is Dark Penchant, which restores mana when enemies die around her. So it's kind of alluding to her wanting to be more on the front line, especially like it's within 2 tiles. So I think she wouldn't be the best Wave Seer. But I think if we were going to put anyone who has access to that class in S tier, we're going to have a pretty loaded S tier because there's like 4 or 5 units that can all do that.
There are, yeah. I really like Wave Seer / Tidecaller, no doubt. It's not, and we're getting a little bit into the class discussion here, which really should be saved for the other video, but I am not as high on it as you are. I don't particularly like Whirlpool in general, so it's a little bit of a shame to have a whole skill that, to me, doesn't feel super useful. But, I mean, just the reduced mana costs and the heals, and then, everything once you get into Tidecaller is also pretty nutty, but I don't think that alone would boost her to S tier. Maybe for some of the other druids, potentially, who are better in that role, but I think for Cass, given the limitations of Ritualist on Demonic, A tier, top of A tier maybe, feels like a good spot for her.
That sounds good to me, honestly. I won't argue too much about that. I had to drop off my high horse a little bit through my Demonic playthrough, so
Demonic will humble a man. There's no doubt about that.
It absolutely does. But you know what one man it doesn't humble?
Oh, is it the man himself, Big S, Saxon, my boy?
It is Saxon, and I'm assuming that you feel the same way, so I'll let you go.
I mean, I think S tier is for Saxon, right? Like that feels like the appropriate spot. It's literally in the name. I mean, Saxon's in the Adept class tree, which is possibly the most busted class tree just in the game. Every single, with one exception, class in that tree is phenomenal, and that's before you even start talking about Divine Flow. Oh my god, absolutely insane. And the thing that's cool about Saxon is he's good in pretty much all of those classes. Maybe not the best in one, but like you want to use him as a Gale, he rocks it. I've been slaughtering stuff with my Gale Saxon. You want to have him as conduit and throw lightning magic around, he does that. You want to have him as a monk and just beat the crap out of things while also being impossible to touch and throwing DBZ key blasts around, like he can do all of it. He's so strong in all of these roles. And then just being able to heal off of his own mana usage and having the ability to nuke big groups of enemies with Call Storm. He's just so good, man. He's so good.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Saxon with Call the Storm in the early game was instrumental. Like, not even just nuking, but even being able to have that chip damage was huge for me. Because I was like, well, I've got 3 enemies that all need to be taken care of. I've got 4 units, none of which can one-shot. Well, hang on, let me AoE, and maybe I clear 2 out of the 3 with the other 3 units. And Saxon just does that. He's like Arthur in that he gets free guaranteed damage on more than one unit when they're grouped up around you and you need to get rid of them. And I, in my Demonic, have not changed him to a different class. I'm going down Monk. It's mostly for a proof of concept for him and Cassandra because I sung their praises so much in Deity, I felt like I had to run it back and see if it works. And more so than Cassandra, Saxon does work because Charged Key, he's already got those very high base might, speed, and dexterity growths in his Monk class. It's like 60% might and 50% speed in the Monk class, or a little bit less than that, I think. But him being able to have that consistently high speed in the mid-teens and then use Charged Key to boost that by 8, he's doubling everything. I think the only thing he doesn't double are like the little super fast dagger enemies, but even then, if they attack him, they're one-ranged, he chunks them back because his crit stat is so high, simply because you get that Fractal Prism, which I used all the way until the end of Deity. You get Fractal Prism so early in the game, and I have that with like 45% crit, so he's doing monstrous amounts of damage with the boosted power, with the boosted crit, with the boosted speed. Yeah, he can't tank more than 2 or 3, but honestly, how many do you need to tank with Saxon?
Yeah. No, it's insane, man. Like, to be able to just say I can double most things on Demonic is such a ludicrous statement that alone rockets you up to S tier, let alone the personal skill, let alone the actual, like, personal action skill, let alone the class availability. Like, he just has, no pun intended, the perfect storm of opportunities to easily be one of your most busted characters, almost no matter how you choose to use him, which is really hard to say for some of these characters. So, yeah, S tier Saxon is unquestionable. I challenge anyone to give me any reason why he doesn't deserve to be there, because, like, my God, have you seen this man? He is insane.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we'll see where he is in terms of S tier. I mean, I feel like him and Arthur have been pretty equal for me. Maybe he's a little bit higher right now, but we'll see where he turns out. I think, regardless of where we put them within S tier, I think all of these units are bonkers.
Definitely.
Now, we've sung the high praises of Saxon a lot, and it's my turn to go first, and I really want you to change my mind on Valeria, because...
Oh boy, here we go. I knew this was going to be a good one.
Yeah, I just have not been able to figure out how to use Valeria. I mean, she has Headstrong, which in theory is a really good personal skill because of the power plus 15 while at full HP, 15%, but her power just isn't that high at base. She's got such low might growth that, like, mine is level 15 right now with 6 might, and she's using daggers in her Nightblade class, which is a low might class to begin with, which is a low might weapon to begin with, I'm sorry, that I'm having trouble dishing out damage with her in Demonic, even after using Grimstroke. Like, I'm only getting 4 heavy poisons. Even she's not doubling consistently, so a lot of times she's been relegated into, like, the healer/speed buffer role for other characters, which I was surprised about, because one of my friends almost soloed Demonic with Valeria, and I'm sitting here scratching my head like, how did you do this? And he used her in her base Nightblade into Anchorant classes. So I think maybe my ring, game is weak, or I'm doing something wrong. But, like, for me, she's hovering, like, she's lower than Riordan. She's about to get benched. She's, like, B and C tier, which I know should not be the case with Valeria. So I need you to change my mind here and drag me out of this gutter that I'm in with Valeria.
All right. Well, I think I can do this for you. No problem. All right, here we go. So Valeria in the early game is not a damage dealer, especially on Demonic. Period. If you can get the crits going on something like Deity, fine, but she doesn't have the kit for that right off the bat. Valeria in the early game, especially on Demonic, is your debuff queen, because you can put vulnerability runes on her knives, and that is where things start to go really nutty between poison stacks and vulnerability. Because she's in Nightblade, and because she has so many good utility support abilities in Grimstroke and First Aid, I don't often use Fleet Feet or whatever it is, but, like, it can obviously be useful, like what you've highlighted with making sure that you can double with certain characters. But just the ability to poison enemies and keep your team up while becoming an absolute champion in terms of dodge, because you can stack so much with Shadow Step, means that she can be on the front line, and she can weaken huge swaths of the enemy forces who are very scary on Demonic in particular, and make the rest of your team far more capable of dealing with them. Then, over time, as you get better daggers, as your team gets more powerful with their abilities, with their classes, with their growths, and you don't need her to be as efficient in terms of debuffs, you can lean more into damage. You can lean more into putting different damaging runes, crit runes on her daggers, getting better daggers in general, all that type of stuff, while still having poison, while still having bleed. That will make it so even if her individual attacks aren't too insane, the crits and the debuffs make up for that in spades. That has been my experience, and it has been consistent between Deity and Demonic thus far. She's not going to be an outright killer. Like, she's not an Arthur or a Saxon in the early game, but what she enables in terms of damage is nearly as good, in my opinion.
Interesting. I might have to try that. I think that might help leverage, because you're right, if she's putting on, like, vulnerability stacks, then it elevates the gameplay of your other weapons, of your other characters by a lot. And I agree, she's been mostly a utility unit for me, which maybe that's kind of why I'm a bit surprised. But I don't know, where would you put her if she's just pure utility for most of the game?
I think she's a solid A tier. The thing about Demonic and the whole exhaustion system is if you're a little too ambitious, even the highest amount of stacks of Shadow Step won't save you when one big enemy comes across and just has the accuracy to be able to finally hit you and take you out. But given how she can hold a choke and have a few different enemies get debuffed on the enemy phase so you can clean them up on the player phase, is definitely something that needs to be considered. Because, like, while damage is way higher on Demonic and characters like, say, Benji coming up can't tank as well as they normally would, dodge is still pretty superior, and Valeria definitely has that in spades with her stat spread and in Nightblade with the abilities. So I think A tier is definitely good. I think she's higher than Gwyn but lower than Cass. We'll see if that changes by the end, but A tier for sure.
You really think she's better than Gwyn?
I think so, just because characters like Gwyn rely on the support of characters like Valeria to reach their max potential. And without that type of support, they just wouldn't be doing what we kind of are used to seeing them do. The support role is that role that is kind of the thankless job in the world of SRPGs, right? But once you actually break it down and look at what each of these characters can do, it's like, oh, yeah, I just wouldn't have had that double. I wouldn't have had that crit, or I wouldn't have had the outright damage if I didn't soften him up with this other character first. So I think so, personally.
Interesting. I mean, I would have probably put her somewhere around here, but I think we can put her in sort of the middle between Cassandra and Gwyn. We've got really all the ladies in the A tier right now.
I mean, and they are some A tier ladies, so...
They are indeed. I will not argue that, although Cassandra is my S tier lady.
I mean, she's pretty good, but the actual S tier is coming up near the end of the list, and I'll have to fight you on that. But I will say too, like, by all means, argue against me. If you think that she should be lower than that, go for it. Like, my opinion is definitely different than yours.
I think the further in we get, we might have to reshape this a little bit. But right now, if in terms of like just pure utility, like I agree, she's doing something here that none of the other units can do, because none of these other ones can get in that class. But I think the further in we get, once we have people that can get in that class and do it more effectively, like Gwyn can do it, but I don't think she's good at Nightblade, for example. And so Valeria has that sort of niche up on Gwyn instead, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think we can keep her in the A tier. I totally agree. And after what you've said, you've kind of convinced me. Like, I'm like, now, okay, you've given me something to think about that I should probably try. And that makes a lot of sense, because I'm envisioning scenarios where, yeah, vulnerability would have been awesome to have in this scenario to clear things out. So you've given me a perspective that I hadn't thought about, which I like.
Boom. And that's the whole draw of SRPGs, right?
Exactly. That's why we do this.
Hell yeah.
All right, let's talk about Benji. So Benji is one of the developers' favorite character. And for me, he has not been good, neither in Dark Deity 1 nor Dark Deity 2. Now, I think he can be good, but what Benji suffers from is the lack of a pure good tank class for him to be in. Because as much as we like to say Gallant is the tank class, it really isn't. It feels like more of a utility class that has some solid, well-rounded growths in defense and fortitude, or just defense, actually, honestly. His base fortitude's pretty high, it's 25%, but the Gallant class only has a 5% growth in fortitude, so he ends up folding to any enemy that's magical-based, which completely takes away from his tank nature. Now, he has a monstrous might growth and a great ability in Head of Steam that helps you increase your power when you attack enemies, so you'll be able to do that damage, but he doesn't have any damage skills, which I find kind of odd. And so Benji's kind of in this weird middle ground where I feel like, well, he actually needs to get into Reaper to really do his damage, because if he can get that high crit with the high might and do some of those absurd one-shots in the Reaper class, then maybe we're talking about something nice here. But then you think about it and you're like, well, Gwyn can do that equally as well, and she's got a good damage personal ability and doesn't need to suffer through the first two-thirds of the game until you get there. So Benji's just kind of in this weird, odd state where I would just be like, yeah, this unit's insta-bench, especially because you get him at a time where you're getting a bunch of other units. And I think we actually did Benji before Alden, but it's fine. We're a little bit out of order. That's okay. But I would honestly probably go C tier with Benji. What are your thoughts?
Interesting. Well, I mean, I can't argue with the logic of B is for Benji and also for bench. I get that. I would argue, though, that where Gwyn is the damage warrior, Benji is the tank warrior. And I do think there's a way to do it, but it's not through Gallant. It's through Devoted. So I think, and I've been experimenting with this in my own playthroughs, and it's been working pretty well thus far, even on Demonic, taking Benji, reclassing him into Devoted, and then taking that into Champion is the way to go for him. And I don't think, especially on Demonic, it's going to get him higher than B, and B is for Benji, so that's fine. But I do think that it does get him there, because while he doesn't have a damage ability, whether you're in Gallant or Devoted, he kind of does, because you can make things bleed. And that is where you can potentially eke out some extra damage with Benji. I've been making good use of Lacerate to get some extra end of combat damage with him, and he's generally tanky enough against physical enemies that any scenario where I can toss him at a bunch of physical enemies, he can lacerate something, basically make sure you can get that lacerate damage going, take out an enemy, and then hold the line against the rest, especially if you've had the opportunity to do a spinning blade and get some block going beforehand, since that doesn't fall off from my experience. So it's not ideal, but I do think that it gets him through to Champion. And then once you're in champion, that's when he can really start to shine, because you can give him so many different ways of being able to get more speed, get some double attacks, just be tanky and get big damage going on multiple enemies, or deal damage and then heal allies. He can definitely get there, but you have to be a little bit more unorthodox about how you get him there, and I think that alone brings him down a bit. But his endgame capabilities are quite good if you can get him there, which is pretty consistent with his father in the first game, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. He takes a lot more to get there, and for me, it's like, well, in Demonic, I don't really have that luxury to get him there, and when you want to talk about the devoted class, you know, it's interesting that you bring it up. Yeah, it has Spinning Blade, and it gives you 14 stacks of light block, but how many, is that, like, really enough, especially on Demonic, where you're taking so much damage, and to take that hit in the defense growth, like, I think Gallant has a 25% defense growth, the devoted class only has 5.
Yeah.
And so you're going to suffer in that class for 20 levels. The difference between him having, let me do the math off the top of my head here. So he has a base of, Benji's base defense is 35%. So a base of 40 over 20 levels is 8 points of defense. Whereas if you give him a base of, with Gallant, that would be 60 over 20 levels, that's 12 defense levels.
Yeah.
So the 4 points of defense over 20 levels might not seem like a lot, but when you're getting doubled, that's 8 less damage that you're taking per round.
Yeah.
And I think for a tank, that's important, especially because the light blocks will only outscale that for maybe 2 or 3 combats, or actually just 1, honestly, because, you know, you're taking 1 hit in Demonic, and that's stripping down all 14 immediately, which is what you're going to start with.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I hear you with the whole, you know, he can do the hemorrhage and he can get that extra after damage, but he really wants light block most of the time. So it feels like in Devoted, you kind of want both up on him at both times. And to really make him work, you would need to go all in on Benji. And I feel like that holds him back, especially compared to the other 6 that we've discussed so far. All 6 of these units can operate on their own to a certain extent with minimal buffs, and Benji just needs to have uptime on all of it. Hemorrhage is nice for bosses, I will give you that. But most enemies, even on Demonic, are dying after 2 or 3 rounds, so you're not really making use of that hemorrhage long term. It's not like Transfusion that Blood Mage does, or Cassandra can do in the Ritualist class, which will hit 3 enemies that you can make use of more consistently. So I feel like if Hemorrhage was doing that, if it was more AoE, and maybe the same thing with Spinning Blade, I would be more inclined to rank him higher. But I can't, in any form of confidence, put him higher than any of these units, I think.
No, I think that's fair. I think you've convinced me. Just the idea behind the difference in defense growths and the way that the block falls off, or the lack of AoE on bleed. No, I think you're right. Benji's one of those characters who can perform, and I despise this term because people have used it incorrectly against me many, many times, but the opportunity cost of using Benji at his max is too great when you're trying to deal with something like Demonic. So I think C is fair.
I agree, and I think it's unfortunate that he's in the class he's in. I think if he was in more of the Beastmaster tree and had access to Ranger, which had like, this is the downfall of Benji. If he had access to Ranger, he would be a different unit altogether, because his mastery is half decent, I think. Actually, I could be wrong. Yeah, no, never mind. He has 5% mastery. But if they had switched that around a little bit, I think Ranger would help, you know, buffer his bases and play to his strengths. And unfortunately, he doesn't have that. And so, you know, just because his name is Benji, I will be putting him at the bottom of B tier for now, with the caveat of being able to bump him down to C depending on how the rest of this list filters out.
I think that's very fair, and I do think, again, having Benji be the gatekeeper of the bottom of B, like, you have to be this tall to pass Benji. That's totally fair, but none of it matters, because we're about to talk about the best tank in the game anyway. His name is Alden. Let's get into this one, because I think this is going to be a spicy discussion.
Oh, go ahead, because honestly, before we had set this up, you had been talking to me about what you were doing with Alden, and for me, Alden was fantastic, but I was only using him as a utility unit in the beginning of the game, and I failed to see what he can actually do. And then when you brought it up, I was like, hold on, this guy isn't cooking. He's making a whole damn masterpiece here. And so I'm going to let you go. I'm going to let you go because this one isn't going to be a spicy one. This is you and I gushing.
All
so
right.
go for it. You tell me about all of the genius that you have crafted with Alden.
Okay, so here's where the vision came from, right? This is where I got the recipe. Dark Deity 1, Battle Mage Alden, tiny little child soldier in full plate mail, punching you in the face with thunder magic and being untouchable while he did so. How can I recreate that in Dark Deity 2? Oh, well, let's see. There's this little class. It's called Aegis, where you coat yourself in magic armor and conjure a big-ass magic sword and beat people with it while making their attacks deal damage to them while you laugh in their face. Perfect for Alden. It was an immediate reclass for me, and boy howdy if he didn't become a one-man army. So, the thing to keep in mind about Aegis and Relic Knight is they have such nice boosts to your defense and your fortitude, combined with the fact that Alden actually has fairly solid defensive stats for a mage. So, he actually gets very strong growths in those classes defensively, on top of having good HP as well. And the beautiful thing about this is kind of like the defensive version of Arthur and Saxon, where their stats don't matter because of the way that their abilities interact. It's the same thing with Aegis and Relic Knight because of Repulsor Shield. With Repulsor Shield and a sufficiently tanky character, you can walk into the middle of the enemy and laugh as they just bounce off of you and take increasing damage depending on how many times you've used Repulsor Shield because it stacks against themselves. It is so disgustingly strong. And then, if you feel like you need to deal some extra damage in the player phase, you have Alden's personal skill that can put vulnerability and weaken on the enemy, so you can just duel a dangerous target until they literally explode due to their own punches cracking against your face. It is so much fun. It is such a good way to play Alden. I literally cannot think of doing a run without having him as the vanguard of my team, baiting in enemies and softening them up for everybody. It's so unimaginably good.
Yeah, and I love that you pointed me towards that, honestly, because I'm using him in the Aegis class in Demonic right now. And I think, you touched on all of the really great aspects of it, but I think one more thing that I want to add on to that is how good Repulsor Shield is. Mm-hmm. See, for a lot of skills, they are number of combat based, right? You'll do one combat and they're gone. The debuffs are the buffs. You'll do two combats and they're gone. Repulsor Shield lasts for 3 turns at base. Mm-hmm. And you can upgrade that to go for 4 turns. So it's not only that you're buffing yourself if you want to use Alden as a frontliner, you can also have him use that utility with another tank. So I have a Dreadnought Khamari going right now, which we will talk about, trust me. Mm-hmm. But I have Repulsor Shield on him and Alden at the same time. And like you said, his base defenses are really, really good. He's got 30% in defense and fortitude. And the Aegis class gives you an extra 35% on top of that. So he's got 65-65 splits across the board, which is disgusting for a mage. Yep. Yeah, the class takes a little bit of a hit in the might area, but do you really care about that if you're just reflecting the damage back? That more than makes up for it, especially because enemies are so tanky and demonic. You're not even doing that much damage in the first place. So I agree with you. I think Alden, just in the Aegis class, is disgusting. But the fact that he has access to the rest of that class tree too means if you want him to do warping or phasing, he can do that as a scholar. If you need him to heal or star surge, he can do that as a geomancer. But I think he really, really shines and does not get eclipsed when he's in the Aegis class, just because of the way that everything synergizes together in terms of growths, as well as his ability. His ability is a little bit underrated, I feel like, because he can do some additional damage for every status effect on the enemy, and you can also debuff with his base ability. So, I mean, I love it. I love it personally. I feel like I have become a changed man because of what we had talked about, and I feel like this gives him a little bit of an S tier utility ranking. What do you think?
I would say so, absolutely. It's especially, again, if you're looking at Demonic, the ability to take your enemy and use their power against them is so invaluable. And the thing with the Aegis class is you need to have the durability to actually survive all the attacks coming at you to then have them be reflected back at your opponent. But because Alden has those bases and because he gets the growths that he does from the class, he can actually do that. He's got the HP, he's got the defense, he's got the fortitude. And as you'll find, as you look at a lot of these characters, having both good defense and good fortitude is fairly rare. And you have such a mix of enemies in Dark Deity 2 in general that have either physical or magical, and they'll be in mixed formations where you really can't avoid getting hit by both around the same time. Having that blend of stats is so incredibly powerful before you even get into the reflection damage. And I mean, we didn't even mention the fact that Aegis also makes it so you deal more damage on the crackback once you've taken a hit. So even then, having relatively low physical attack is not that big of a deal, because you'll still be dealing more damage on the crackback. You add on to that rings that make people bleed when you hit them. You add on to that you're using swords, which you can have a rune that makes it magical instead of physical if you want to target that. There's just so much versatility to this one class alone. It is just truly disgusting. I was blown away when my mind expanded and I realized the smorgasbord of abilities I had at hand. It was so good.
Definitely 100% agree with you. He's an easy S tier, and his utility in the early game is unmatched. And he recruits at a really high level too, so he gives you that crutch early in the game too. So we can't forget that early game Jagan sort of archetype. That's where Alden falls.
So this is for the old FE heads out there. I have to ask really quick. What do you think? Jagan, Oife, or Titania for the archetype? Or Seth? Ooh.
I don't think he's a Seth, but I do think he can be a pretty solid Oife or Titania.
I would say a Titania, yeah. Seth is a whole nother level. I don't think we have a Seth in the game, really. But, I think Titania would be a good equivalence there. So, yeah. Absolutely top tier stuff from the Child Soldier.
100%. All right, let's talk about Zanele. So Zanele was one of my favorite units to use in Deity. I had her in Quick Draw, and then I went the Slayer route with her afterwards for just bonkers ricochet amounts of damage. It was really fun, and with all of her commands, she was just stacking on hits upon hits upon hits, and there's that little upgrade that you can do with the runes that lets you quad and hit twice, and so just proccing off billions of ricochets with that was so much fun. But on Deity, she actually struggles with damage a little bit, and because of her might growth being relatively on the lower end, I think it's 25%, so it's good, but it's not crazy, and Quick Draw doesn't really boost it by that much either. I think it's only 15%, so or maybe no, it's 25% actually. Never mind. She gets actually pretty decent growth with Quick Draw. I take that back. But I feel like because of her personal ability, increasing pet mastery scaling by 25% or damage by 25%, her damage is really meant to be done with those summons or the commands. And the class that really utilizes that is Tamer. And Tamer also has an extra 40% mastery growth on top of her already high 40% base mastery growth. So I'm still cooking my new Zanele in Demonic, but I feel like she's going to be big single target damage there. And with her command Capuchin giving you gold, that's something that no other unit does, and gold is oh so very important in Demonic. I feel like this grants her at least a top of A discussion. What do you think?
Oh my god, it's the Capuchin with the steel chair! Enters iron pipe falling meme. It is, you're absolutely correct. You're 100% correct. Tamer is where Zanele needs to be, especially on Demonic, because again, as we're seeing, direct damage abilities absolutely key here, and the Capuchin does phenomenal damage with it because of that mastery scaling, because Zanele has better mastery with pet commands, and then in Tamer you get even higher scaling mastery. That is absolutely where you need to be, bar none. And because of that direct damage not really being affected by enemy stats in the same way that regular attacks are, you can actually guaranteed kill stuff while also getting gold, which is massively important. I don't know if you have been victimized by the old oak trees or whatever they are, the 2/2 range mage trees that are ridiculously durable and also deal a ton of damage. She has been my number one slayer of those trees, based solely on the back of the clawing little thingies of her monkey that also gets me money. So yeah, Zanele, top of A easily, maybe not S because she can have issues with durability, but in my heart I want to put her there. Top of A is probably the right place though.
Yeah, I think with her utility and like we said, the single target guaranteed damage, she does get A, but she's not on the level of these boys up here, the bonkers boys.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Try a ritualist for those trees. You'll thank me later. They're pretty slow and they have no fortitude, so my Cassandra actually clears them relatively easily.
All right, I will keep that in mind. Thank you for the heads up.
Yeah. All right, that was a relatively quick discussion. I'm surprised how smoothly that went, but let's talk about Khamari. So Khamari is interesting, and I'll let you go first because I have some thoughts, but tell me what you think.
Khamari is... he almost feels like the Jagan that joins mid-game. Like, he should be a character that you kind of drop after a little while after using him as a crutch, but only if you use him in Ritualist, because that's definitely not where he actually wants to be, IMO. The real place that Khamari wants to be is in some sort of a tanking role. And, you know, taking him through Juggernaut, as you've talked about you're doing on your run, is definitely the way to do that, because he has a nice mix of support healing through his quick stitching, which is a very powerful ability, and then also very good defensive stats and coming in at a high level. So kind of like Alden, you can use him as a crutch to be able to rely on him surviving long enough to tank and weaken enemies, and then let your other lower level characters come in and clean up and get the XP. So I don't think he's an S tier character, but I do think that he makes it into A just because he enables the rest of your team, kind of like a Valeria, not through the same functionality, but kind of fills a similar role, and I do like him for that. But it does require a reclass, so if you're worried about the resources to be able to actually do that through like astral coins and money, then it could be an issue, but I think he's very solid.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, you know, Khamari's base defense is 30% and his fortitude is 25%. So he's got some high base defenses, and his might isn't too shabby at 25%. Mm-hmm. The Juggernaut class is a no-brainer for him because that gives him an extra 30 and 25 to bring him up to 55 defenses, which, granted, are not as high as the 65 for Alden, but he starts with way higher bases, and the Juggernaut class boosts him up to like immediately the mid to high teens, which even on Demonic, he's tanking fairly well. Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking so much about Repulsor Shield, you know, the Juggernaut class gets their own reflector as well.
Yep.
So he can put that on himself and then also stack Repulsor Shield for absurd amounts of reflect damage because they both stack. So he's getting the 9 and the 12 from Repulsor Shield. Like, all of the enemies are getting chunked for at least 22 damage. And with his pretty high might and access to the Axe weapon class, those hit really hard. Mm-hmm. And pretty early on, you can get the Mauler Axe, which is like a 22 might base weapon.
Oh, it's so gross.
It's disgusting. And so he will be chunking enemies down pretty good just by virtue of one-banging and reflecting. So I think his utility as a tank is really good. Where he suffers is the fact that enemies in Demonic have such high might that not only is he getting doubled because of his low speed, but he's also getting hit for like constant chip damage, like 5 times 2 or 6 times 2 or 8 times 2. His fortitude is much better, so he's actually much better of a mage tank, but he is getting chunked by those physical classes that he wants to tank and spank up close. So I'm kind of at a crossroads with him right now where he's actually carrying my run relatively well and keeping me tanky and letting me hit with all of my little, you know, nukers from behind him. But I'm starting to try and think about how he's going to get the deeper we get into the run, because he's already at maximum supports from the rings that he has, with his defenses getting like +9s in total, in addition to all the reflection. And I don't know, like the class skills themselves that we have, Dreadnoughts isn't good for defenses. Mm-hmm. It's one that's for accuracy. And then when we talk about the Juggernaut skill, what was the Juggernaut skill? Let me pull it up. Hold on. You restore mana, and so the skills are good, but they don't give him any defenses. And so I feel like that's where he might end up falling off in the mid to late game. So I don't know.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah. I just don't know with him. And then like the rest of the classes aren't better for tanking. And so where do I go from here after Juggernaut if he starts to fall off? Does he just get benched in lieu of a better unit at that point? It's very possible. But I'm committed to trying. And I think I have this, like, he's definitely in the early game up here somewhere. Mm-hmm. Like in between Valeria and Cassandra for me, just because he's so consistent at, again, dishing out that chip damage consistently with support, but again, with support with 2 lines underneath it. Otherwise, he doesn't really function very well.
Yeah, it's definitely a failing of the Juggernaut class, and even then, it's not really like a failing, it's just a different role. It is, of all of the tanks, the most mixed bruiser tank. Like, it can tank, but it also wants to deal damage. And you can see a very clear split in the way its abilities and passives are designed, right? So you can't give yourself block, you can't self-heal, you can't do any of that. But again, with the double underlined with support, everything that it does do will make it a devastating frontline tank that can also clear out enemies, or at the very least severely weaken them for you. So if you have like an elementalist backing him up and putting like ice block on him or something like that, then it's phenomenal. But you do need that support, and do you have the resources for that by the end game in Demonic? Hard to say. I'm not there yet, but in theory, it could work, but it's definitely not as self-sufficient as something like Alden. No doubt about that.
Agreed. So what do you think about placement-wise? Like, I put him here because in my playthrough, he's definitely been outperforming Valeria and Gwyn, but I could definitely see an argument for putting him like maybe at the top of B or even the bottom of A, because not everyone's going to be as dedicated to actually making this work. Yeah,
no, definitely. I would say this could even be something where we need to revisit this and do like an endgame Demonic tier list or something once we've both finished it.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Because there's definitely some potential for some shakeups here by the time that you do get to the end. Where he's at right now, I think, is definitely fine, though. Just having another character that can reliably handle the front line, even if they're not your primary tank, if it's like a little bit of an off-tank role, he does fill that very well.
And if we're talking deity difficulty as well, he'll be incredible.
Oh, yeah. No doubt. Absolutely no doubt.
All right, so we can keep him sort of in the middle of A, not too high, not too low. Definitely better than these two and more consistent. Again, consistency is something I really value in SRPGs, and so when you get that consistency, I feel like the units by themselves rise above and beyond. One unit that has struggled for consistency with me, at least in my first playthrough, and is starting to improve in the second one, is Zuhair. And I would love to hear your thoughts on Zuhair, honestly, because I feel like I'm only just starting to unlock his potential. So tell me what you've done with him.
Nothing.
Okay.
I don't like Zuhair. It might be a failing of the Fragilin class that he comes in. I have tried to switch him around to other classes, but he suffers from being in the same class tree as Saxon and not having anywhere near the levels of capability that Saxon has. I like that his personal skill makes him the, movement-wise, speediest character in the game. That is really cool. Just having that extra move range allows you to do more with him. But I've found no matter what I try to do with him, unless you send him directly down Monk Ascendant, which is just going to be good for anybody.
Yeah.
He just doesn't perform as well as the other adepts do. So I am really not a fan. I kind of would just say he's like C tier and leave it at that. But, if you've been making him work better than that, by all means, let me hear your thoughts, because I am pretty down on this guy.
Yeah, so Zuhair, movement is king in SRPGs, regardless of what we say. And I think with Zuhair, it's important to realize that this guy is meant to be your utility/support. Mm-hmm. And for him, he actually has a monstrous mastery growth. And I think putting him in the Monk class, that'll be good for anyone. Monk Ascendant, like we said, is guaranteed stats, it's guaranteed damage, it's just a really good class overall. But what would really utilize his mastery class is actually Conduit. And I've put him in Conduit to try and boost that, because in Conduit, his mastery ends up getting a 60% growth, and he gets Chain Lightning. And in Demonic, I know you're not quite there yet, but because I'm getting mobbed by large swaths of enemies, using Chain Lightning is actually something that you can do relatively easily, and you will hit your 3 or 4 enemies all at once. The chain skills, like a Transfusion and like a Chain Lightning, are so valuable because you don't need to be within a specific AoE. They will jump as long as the enemies are within 2 ranges of each other. And so that's what's so useful. And Chain Lightning starts with 21 base damage, which might not seem like a lot, but with his mastery growth further into the game, I expect that will improve. Fragilin, I agree with you, is just a bad class, and we'll talk about this when we do the class tier list. But I think he's a worse monk than Saxon, and I feel like his role is best sorted to chip damage and utility, because, with the Conduit class, you do have the Chain Lightning, but you also have Defibrillate, which can be an emergency backup heal. And I've actually been making use of Defibrillate relatively well because, like we said, Khamari gets chunked down pretty low, and being able to heal him all the way up back to full without the setback of Defibrillate is sometimes a nice panic button for Zuhair. So, and again, because his mastery is so high, the healing ends up increasing exponentially. So I agree. He's probably C or B tier. I don't think he's on the same level of A tier, but I don't think he's worse than Benji.
I mean, maybe that's our sign that we need to bump Benji down a tier.
It might be.
Maybe C is for Benji.
It might be, but we can keep going and see what fills out the B tier. But I think he falls like somewhere in between Riordan and Benji for sure.
That's fair. I think, see, me, I am very hot and cold on movement abilities. So, like, something like, say, Reaper that can just teleport itself across the battlefield, obviously phenomenal. Whereas just, like, what was it, Dance Partner or Spin Class or whatever the heck his personal skill is called, where he could just, like, move an enemy or an ally and switch places with them, has never really felt super useful for me. So I put a lot of stock on that in terms of, like, well, what are you bringing to this class tree that others aren't? But then on the flip side, that is exactly where your argument for his mastery skill comes in, and, like, or his mastery stat, I should say, and how much damage you can do with that. So I know I definitely need to give him another look. He's one of the first characters I benched and never looked back, so I don't have a very fair assessment on him, so I will defer to you on this one. But
same. I benched him very early as well, but he's just starting to have that just ever so little bit of utility on Demonic that he's going to stick around for a little bit, so I'll be able to test him out.
All right, fair enough.
Okay, well, let's move on to Eve, and from my understanding, you're also a pretty big Eve fan, so I'll let you take the lead on this one because I'm not as experienced with her as you are. So.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, Zuhair needed some discussion, maybe low B, high C, whatever. Eve is S tier, period.
Okay.
There's literally, like, you can't argue it. She's in a incredibly powerful position, even above Valeria, as probably the preeminent dodge tank in the game, while also having access to Slayer so that she can counter everything at 1-2 range, and having a personal skill that makes her infinitely more dodgy the higher up in levels that you get because of the luck scaling. So, yeah, Eve is so insanely broken. Like, and for full context, I've actually talked with Chip about this as well. And I was like, this might need to be changed, man. She's real strong. He's like, she's already been changed like 3 times. She was so insanely strong before. Oh my god. For those of you who don't know, Chip is the director of the game. Yeah, I can see why, because oh my lord, I have never had a stronger crit machine in either of these games. Like, this is unpatched release version of Sia levels of ridiculously bonkers here, and I will stand by that. And then you have Licky Lasso. Oh my god, Licky Lasso is a whole different discussion. Like, yeah, Eve is stupidly disgusting, and she's definitely one of the best characters in the game, bar none.
I can see that. I honestly dropped her immediately in my Deity playthroughs. Yeah, I had other units that I was liking too much, and I never really experimented with her, but I'm using her now in Demonic. And I feel like I'm only just starting to understand her utility with especially Licky Lasso, but as well as her personal skill efficiency, stacking up that power even higher with the more accuracy that she has, as well as the Cutthroat skill Scrapper, which increases dodge by the amount of luck that she has, and especially with her very high base luck.
Yep.
I'm starting to slowly see that. I think it'll take a little bit of time for her to start to snowball for me, especially as I get more runes to enhance daggers, which I am having a terrible shortage of in the early game. I'll say that.
Yeah, definitely same.
But I can see it. My only question is, we talked about this a little bit with Valeria, but how consistent will her dodge tanking be on Demonic? And I fear that because she doesn't have access to that Shadow Step stacking, the dodge tanking might be a little bit of a problem for Eve, and she may end up becoming relegated to Licky Lasso as more of a utility unit most of the time, which anyone in that class chain can end up doing, and if not potentially better, because her base mastery growth is actually quite low.
No, you're definitely not wrong there. And again, this is where, with the rest of these characters, you're going to see I don't have any experience with them on Demonic yet, so I can't speak to them in terms of that. But her stat growth is so good that with just a little bit of smart terrain usage and potentially the right rings, I can definitely see her still being able to dodge tank consistently. But even if she can't, just the class availability that she has and the like multi-ranged enemy phase utility that you have, if you're not letting her get mobbed by multiple enemies, just like a few at a time, she'll be able to handle that no problem. So I think the dodge tank concerns aren't too big of a deal. And then the utility of her abilities is so phenomenal. Like, I don't think it's been changed yet, but like you can get, and this is for any like character that can use these classes, but you can get a 10 mana Wyvern Breath or Bite or whatever command that puts severe poison on things and deals extra damage. So having the ability to do that, do the ricochets, have the extra power, have the extra luck, the way, and this is all just for Slayer, like, you know, the other classes probably not going to be as good for Eve, but she doesn't need them. The way her personal stats and skills come together with that class are so insanely disgusting. I really would be surprised if she is any less effective on Demonic as she was for me on Deity. But, you know, we'll have to see.
Okay, so do you still think she's S tier? Because we put Zanele with all of her power and her utility at the top of A. And I feel like just from the way things are going in Demonic so far, if we want to really incorporate that, I don't know if she quite breaks into the level of these three in terms of the consistency with the scaling just being so harsh.
And that's fair. Again, I definitely have to defer to you on that one. No doubt about that. I'm based solely off of Deity, and in terms of Deity, she blows Zanele out of the water 10 out of 10 times, like, no doubt. Okay. Just because in my experience, Zanele is not able to survive on enemy phase in the way that Eve is able to, and based on the enemy density on some later maps, that is vitally important. Mm-hmm. But if you feel like there's definitely going to be some issues with Demonic, then I'm totally okay with you bumping it down a bit, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, her base HP growth is very high, which it gives her that bulk. Now, her defense and fortitude aren't, but she can take a couple hits where Zanele just folds most of the time. One is the Ranger, and one is meant to be the more in your face. But they both have access to Licky Lasso, and so I feel like using that as a differentiator isn't a good bar to use. You would have to use sort of more of the personal skill, and Eve's personal skill is purely based on power, so damage. I don't know. I've got a little bit of a mixed feeling about this one, because using her as a Licky Lasso sort of pseudo frontline tanker dodge tank unit could be good. Yeah, I don't know.
I would say we could probably split the difference. If you're not comfortable with putting her in S, that's fine, but I do think she's better than Zanele. So I would say top of A, if nothing else.
I'll take that. Yeah, I can take that.
All right.
Yeah, that's honestly where I was thinking of putting her anyways.
Yeah, fair enough then. Works for me.
Okay.
Again, if we do that like end game Demonic tier list, then we'll be able to see a little bit more definitively how some of these fall, but that feels comfortable for now.
Sounds good to me. Okay, so next up is Haoran. And when I first saw Haoran in the game, I was like, this is an interesting design of a character that I don't know if I'm going to use. And I feel like Haoran can be looked at in two different ways. As the penultimate support unit, if you put him into Waveseer and then Tidecaller, because his mastery is so high, his defenses are pretty good, his speed is poor, but he doesn't want combat, and his HP is rather middling. And he has already that Mists of Renewal healing that is very so nice with the Wavecaller 30% mana reduction that it just makes him a super efficient healer. Mm-hmm. Having said that, in my next playthrough, I kind of want to put him into Elementalist because his mastery is so incredibly high that I feel like he would combo very well with the Elementalist increased mastery growth of 30% as well. He'd have 70%, and that would turn him into both a nice shielder as well as a very, very good nuker when we need it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I feel like he gets a little bit of a... Because, like, he can go into Juggernaut. He wouldn't be as good as Khamari. He can go into Ritualist. He's not fast enough to make use of it like Cassandra. So, you really need to look at Waveseer versus Elementalist. Everyone is good in Waveseer. Mm-hmm. Everyone. But not everyone is good in Elementalist, and I feel like... Did you use him as Elementalist?
I actually dropped Haoran pretty early on, because I didn't need the healing, and it's pretty much the only role that I really saw for him. And then I used Laurai in Elementalist, so...
Okay.
I fully agree with what you're saying, though. I personally kind of feel like he's probably going to be best in Elementalist, just because of that mastery growth and because you do have so many different methods of healing already at this point in the game. I think he's good in both, though. I definitely think he's a strong character, regardless.
I think, when we talk about character tier lists, the way I would generally want to think about is what is their maximum potential and what is that maximum potential compared to others. Putting him in Waveseer is just good because Waveseer is good no matter what. Any of the characters with access to Waveseer are just immediate S-tier support units. But for him, his best class is probably going to be Elementalist, just based off the numbers. Like, he'll get 70% mastery, he'll have a 65% might growth, his low speed is already sort of mostly unsalvageable at 15%, and the Elementalist only has 10% speed growth. So he's not really losing much by taking that dip there, and being able to do those big damage moves with that high mastery growth. I feel like he would probably end up on the level of an Arthur when he gets into tier 3. Now, getting into tier 3 is an adventure on its own, and I definitely wouldn't be bargaining to putting him in S tier. But I'm looking at B tier with Benji at the end there. Like, is he worse than Benji? No. Is he worse than Zuhair? No. Is he worse than Riordan? No, even if you go into Elementalist, I think, the problem with that is Flame Strike is so damn expensive. It's a 75 cost mana skill, and so his efficiency is not going to be there, but he will be doing some pretty good 1-2 range, single target mage damage with decent defenses. But I don't know. I think he's just not I think he's probably similar in class to Riordan, if even lower, simply because you have Riordan from Chapter 1. You've been building this character from the very beginning. And so if I were to just on gut feeling, not looking at his class capabilities, because again, Waveseer and Tidecaller are so broken, I would end up putting him as sort of an in-between Zuhair and Riordan here, simply on the basis of availability. You don't get him until Chapter 12. That's almost halfway through the game. That's kind of my inclination.
No, that's fair. I may just be blinded by the idea of, like, whoa, Haoran Spirit Bomb be upon ye, but, I think in terms of overall capability, he's a fine addition, but also he's a candidate to be benched no matter what you're doing with him, and that definitely needs to drag him down through the ranks a little bit. Mm-hmm. So, no, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Okay. All right. I mean, that was an easy one. I feel like that's going to be a pretty common discussion probably once we get to... actually, no, it'll be a different discussion for Laurai, because Laurai, I have opinions on her, and she's the only one left in that class. But before we get there, we're jumping a little bit ahead. We got to talk about my girl, Mashal.
Oh, yeah, we do, buddy. Mashal the GOAT. She's phenomenal.
Mashal is a beauty. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, I have a type. and Mashal is that type. I mean, so is Cassandra, don't get me wrong. But Mashal, when I saw her, I was like, thumbnail girl.
Yeah.
Thumbnail girl.
You are not wrong about that, my friend.
Yeah. The content creator in me is like, ooh, baby.
Ooh, that's some clickbait right there. Let's go.
Yep. But I'll let you go since I went first on Haoran. Okay. Tell me about what you did with your Mashal.
Okay. So I've run Mashal a few different times now, because I'm also doing a randomized recruits and classes and all that type of fun stuff run on my Steam Deck, and she actually joined in the Alden slot, which was very interesting. So she came in pretty powerful. So I've used her as a Gale and as a Conduit, and both have been very, very effective for me. Now, through watching your video, I know you have... or at least you had, I don't know if it's changed, some opinions about her Flame Infusion personal skill, but I personally love it. I absolutely adore Flame Infusion because, like, why do I need to use abilities if I can just crit my enemies to death, right? Mm-hmm. It seems pretty good. But just, having Noble Affect to get the extra dodge and the accuracy when the enemy's a lower level, it just encourages you to really max her out, and then you get rewarded for that even more, which is great. Very powerful personal skill. Flame Infusion, I think, is a very solid option if you want to turn her into a raw damage dealer, which is a role that she fits very well. She's got the stats to deal a bunch of damage. She's happy as a mage. She's happy as a sword fighter. I mean, hell, she's absolutely, again, happy as a monk/ascendant, because anyone is, really. Mm-hmm. Like, in terms of mid-game recruits who are absolutely baller damage dealers, you wouldn't expect to run into someone that can potentially compete with Arthur and Saxon, but I do think she is vying for that tier. Maybe she doesn't break all the way into S, but if she doesn't, I mean, she's the pinnacle of A. No doubt about that. You can do so much with her. She's so versatile, and having that amount of damage capability, especially on Demonic, is really pretty nasty. So, tell me what your thoughts are, but I think she's really high up there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Mashal has a terrible mastery growth, right?
Yes,
so that immediately, it's 15%, which is on the lower end, but that immediately rules her out of being a conduit or a stormcaller. Now, you can do that because her speed growth is pretty high, but that class is pretty bad. Her defenses are also pretty low, so that takes her out of the Virgilian sort of Godfrost class as well. It's just not synergistic with what she wants to do. You can do it because the flexibility of this game is so high. But when we're talking about Mashal, we're talking about either Gale or Monk for her. And I think as a Monk, she's probably just a little bit lower than Saxon. And here's why. Her might growth is just a smidge lower than Saxon's. He's got 35% and she's got 30. She actually has 30 in might, speed, and dex. So all around offensively, she's bonkers.
Yeah.
Saxon is a little bit bulkier as a Monk. And I feel like with Charged Key already giving you so much more speed, that speed growth on her is less relevant than it should be. It's still very good, don't get me wrong, and Monk Ascendant for her is absolutely her best class. She will frontline very well. But Saxon is a little bit tankier and does a little bit more damage and has far more availability that you've probably invested in him way further down the line. So I think she can break into S tier for that second half of the game, but if you already have Saxon, I think she's not as good as he is and not as influential.
Fair.
And I know people hate the availability argument, but I agree with you. She's in A tier. I anticipate that she will be more consistent than Eve, Zanele, and Cassandra, just by virtue of being in that Monk class. Now, Gale, I ran her as Gale in Deity, and I have mixed opinions on Gale. Obviously, Flame Infusion is hers and hers alone, and she can use that. As a Monk, you're probably putting your mana elsewhere, and you're getting that crit from somewhere else. You won't need it, but I ran her with the Zweihander, which is a high crit, high power weapon that you get midway through the game, honestly way too early, and I ran a full crit build, so I was getting up to like the 80s, 90s, and 100s with her, but that class tends to have a lower might growth and a lower might base, and so you're not always critting and killing things in the Gale class, and she ends up being more relegated to support, which Swift Winds is an incredible skill, but again, that's a class skill. That's not a Mashal thing. So I guess to play to her strengths, you would probably want to go Monk, and if you do go Monk, again, this is kind of the Waveseer Tidecaller argument, she's just going to be a great unit midway through the game that will replace anyone that you need to replace. I'm okay putting her sort of somewhere near the top of A, maybe higher than Cassandra, and then, I don't know, depends on how you want to think about the utility of an Eve or Zanele. What would you say?
So the thing that I like about Mashal is that she does, if you're out-leveling the enemy, get those free boosts. And that is not something that can be ignored, in my opinion. Like, if you're talking about trying to survive on enemy phase and, like, having dodge, having the survivability that you need, then just being like, yo, I can get 15 dodge for free, or hey, I can guaranteed or more guaranteed hit the dodgy enemies that you definitely will encounter because of Noble Affect, that is really, really strong. So I would say that at least puts her above Zanele. Again, I'm real biased with Eve, and I fully acknowledge that, but like the capability of that personal skill as just a blanket buff really can't be ignored. And I haven't actually thought to look at this really, but I don't think there's like an actual change in enemy levels on demonic. It's just stats, right?
You know, I briefly glanced at that based on the chapter I'm in right now. So most of my characters are hovering around the 14-15 range at chapter 12. And most of the enemies are level 16. So it's either a skill issue with me optimizing my experience, or they're all slightly higher level. So I feel like the consistency of that might not entirely be there the entire time. Again, I could be wrong, but in terms of consistency, I feel like that skill won't always be relevant. And again, dodge and accuracy with the enemy levels being, or the enemy stats being so much higher, will be a little bit less consistent. So I agree. I think Eve might be higher than she is. But just by virtue of her class ability with Monk, I would put her pretty high in general.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think in A tier, maybe just below Eve is a very, very solid spot for her, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we're getting towards sort of the latter third of our tier list, and so the latter third of the game to start considering, or maybe halfway through with Aya. And Aya is a unit that I think I underutilized in my playthrough. I just sort of put her into Scholar because I wanted an extra phaser, and then I kept her in Lore Master because the the convenience of Lore Master was so good with what I was running, and so I never really used her Demon Blood personal skill. But I have seen screenshots, and I can say that Aya would be an absolute atrocity if built correctly.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
and it's funny, we did the exact same thing, because I also kept her in the Scholar Lore Master thing on my first run, and it worked, but like just because those classes are so good for utility, it wasn't because of her.
Yeah, and I think her being able to sort of jump in and explode with poison on all the enemies, lowering their stats with her Demonic Call skill.
Oh,
Sorry, not Demonic Call. The Warlock skill.
Poison Nova?
Yeah, Poison Nova. She's already got decent mastery, and Warlock has an okay mastery growth last I checked, but I can double check that. No, it's 10%. Okay. So the scaling of that won't be very high, and I don't know if you want her in the middle of a bunch of different classes. Now, having said that, being able to poison enemies, lowering their damage potential, and then absorb it, increasing your damage potential is good, but she needs 2 turns to do that. And for her to really do that, you need a Wave Seer with a ranged Dance or Refresh skill to really make utility of her. So, and that depends on what you're doing with the rest of your other units. Like, my Wave Seer was almost solely focused on a Saxon opening turn 1, or letting Arthur nuke twice, because that's more consistent levels of damage, or potentially more consistent than having an AoE-dependent Poison Nova, then absorbing all the stats and letting you nuke. And I don't know how long the absorption lasts. Do you know?
Well, the first thing that we need to point out here as well is she doesn't absorb off of enemies, only off of allies.
Ah, okay.
And so that makes the consistency very, very hard to work with. And that's the main reason that I have issues with her.
Okay.
If it was something that you could apply and then absorb and get that stat boost, that's one thing. But now you're relying solely on what the enemy can do to you. And that is going to change wildly from map to map. So on the map that she comes in, she's as a warlock. You have those benefits of like getting healing when you attack poisoned enemies, all that type of good stuff. And then you can also be applying poison, but there's a lot of enemies that are going to put status effects on you as part of their enhancements. So she can get a lot of benefits from that. So in that map, I was like, oh my God, she's insane. What the hell? Like, she just gets all these free stat bonuses. This is absolutely nuts. And then immediately on the next map, that didn't exist anymore. I was like, oh, she just fell off a cliff. Her skill is now useless. And it's a very much like a metronome swinging back and forth on whether she's going to be useful or not. And that's why I slapped her into Scholar in the first place.
Yeah.
As for your question, I think it's still, like, in terms of things falling off, I think it still functions in the same way. It's like when you attack, a poison stat falls off, but it was just a buff rather than a nerf. I think it still functions the same way in that regard.
So she can't really be that super efficient, consistent tank mage then.
Correct. Unless you have a ton of enemies that are applying bleed and poison and all sorts of fun stuff to you when you kill them, and then she just starts snowballing on an enemy turn and rolling face and keeps getting more stacks on her, then it's great. But again, you're fully dependent on what the map is throwing at you in that regard.
Yeah, so then I struggle in terms of where to place her, because I don't think she's as consistent as all of our A tier people.
No, definitely not.
So she probably winds up somewhere in B tier, and it feels like this conversation is very similar to the Haoran conversation we were having.
This might be a controversial take, I think she's in C.
Ooh, do you think she's worse than Benji?
I do, I really do. Because at the end of the day, at the very least, you can take Benji and you can throw him in a choke point with a bunch of physical enemies and he'll do okay. Aya's a squishy wizard who also relies not solely, because, the wizard classes are good, but she relies so heavily in terms of herself as a unit, taking the benefits of the classes out of the equation on what the enemy is doing. And, maybe this is just me as like the Warhammer Magic the Gathering player, but if I'm trying to look at how I'm going to build my strategy and it's reliant almost entirely on what the enemy is doing, I can't account for that. And I hate that. I do not like that at all. So at least Benji, I know he can be a tank, if nothing else, when I need him to be against the right target. Aya is just, I don't know, spin the roulette wheel, I guess.
You know what? Let's piss people off. Let's do it.
Yeah! Tell us why we're so wrong in the comments and give Link King a bunch of engagement on this video. Let's go.
They definitely will. They definitely will.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a way that you can make her work, but I've just been very underwhelmed with everything I've tried to do thus far.
Yeah, I stuck her in Lore Master, and I just used that 15% mana save for everything else, and she did well, but anyone else can do that too, so it's not specific to her.
She's just a generic at that point, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that, but like...
It's a shame because she has such good offensive growths, like 35 might and 30 speed. There was some real capability here for like a dodge tank mage, for example, which I guess you can kind of do with Warlock, but it feels like a little bit sub-optimized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely get where you're coming from with that, but fortunately, we have a character coming up here in the semi-nearest future that gets to do that role far better than I ever could, so we can talk about it then.
Okay. Well, let's do the next character on the list, and that is Tusk.
Tusk.
Now, Tusk is a character that I immediately brushed off initially. And I completely dropped him, and I never used him, like literally the chapter after he joined. And I honestly barely even looked at him. But, because I'm doing my demonic run with the absolute intention of making tanks work in any way, shape, or form I can, Tusk kind of pops off the screen. He's got 70% HP growth, a monstrous 40% might, so he'll hit very hard, and 30% defense. Now, his fortitude sucks ass, and no matter what class you put him in, that's not going to be fixed. So I think you just give up on mage tanking with Tusk. But he can do it, and the Ranger class is really good at that. In addition to that, the Ranger class is also a axe-wielding class, which are super heavy weapons, and his ability, Brute Strength, synergizes very nicely with that because you just ignore weapon weight. And he's got some pretty okay-ish speed. I think it was like 13 or 14 when he joins. So yeah, he's going to get doubled by most things, but he's not getting doubled by tanks, which is important.
That's true.
And he will slap back pretty hard. The only problem I have with Tusk is he almost exclusively needs to be either in Ranger or Tamer, and he doesn't really have the mastery to justify Tamer, and so he kind of gets shoehorned into the Ranger class. He's got too low speed to make use of Quick Draw, and especially Cutthroat, and his luck growth is pretty atrocious as well, so you don't really want him in Cutthroat either. So he's very much a one-trick pony that is going to be a Ranger. And so for him, I feel like we've been sort of pushing aside class-based discussions, but this guy is someone who purely wants to be Warden.
Yeah.
And the problem with Warden is that it doesn't get any real boosted tanking potential.
Yeah.
And it's kind of similar to the Dreadnought in this vein. Its personal ability is Protector, and it helps other allies. Its abilities are to summon a Grizzly Bear, which is really nice, don't get me wrong, you get an extra unit on the field, and then the other one is to apply stun, so it doesn't boost his defenses, and so you're entirely going to be reliant on his base, which, again, is very good, but is it enough?
I mean, I really think it's not, and the issue is, if we're talking about a tank, we're already nixing Fortitude, as we discussed, so you've got no mage tanking. So already, Alden and Khamari are blowing him out of the water. Then, yeah, he has axes, and he can hit pretty hard, but in my experience, his accuracy is pretty atrocious too. Like, he very much has that feeling of, like, early FE6 Axe Warrior, but, like, just tankier, right?
Yeah.
And then when you have, again, characters like Khamari and Alden that, partially because of the classes that they're tanking in, have guaranteed damage output while you're just hoping that he slaps something with his axe. Oh, that's another really nasty knock against him. And then, yeah, mastery, non-existent. He has a 15% mastery growth in Ranger, like, ow. So even then, like, his pet commands and everything, not going to be great. I think I'm going to make the argument that Tusk is our potentially first and only D-tier character.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
And it's a shame because I love him. I love a good orc. But man, he does feel like an orc too.
He is just a character that was created but doesn't have a class within his tree that really plays to his strengths, which is a shame. I feel like if Warden was a better tuned tank class, we could potentially have something to play with here. But it's just not, and any mage that comes up to him, he will absolutely fold. He has the highest HP growth in the game, so he'll have a fat HP base, but that doesn't mean anything if you're getting hit by like 40 times 2 from a single mage and dying. I can't have my tank doing that. It's absurd.
He'll be out here just twerking at the enemy like, yeah, come hit me, and they throw one lightning bolt at him and he just turns to dust immediately.
Yeah, it's really bad, and he also doesn't have any damage reflection either, which is what Khamari has and Alden will have. And so, you know, like, I don't know what we're doing here. I think it's sad. I really wanted to make him work, but the more I look at it and I look at the demonic levels, like, even in Deity, this guy's going to struggle, and that's how you know it's bad.
Yeah, because Deity in DD2 is a very different beast than Deity in DD1. Like, Deity and DD1 could be nasty, but here it's definitely more of a cakewalk by design, and I think that's fine. But yeah, when even there you're like, I don't know if I really want this guy, that's damning. You know, give me a ROM hack where I can make champion Tusk, and this is a different discussion, but unfortunately, that is not the world that we live in.
Oh, yeah. Well, but fortunately, we have an actually pretty good orc to talk about next up, and that is Laurai. And I know you've been very excited to tell me about your Laurai, so go for it.
Okay, so I've used Laurai in 2 different ways, only on Deity, because again, I don't have her in Demonic, but I got her really early on in my randomized run, which I know is not the best indicator of things, but it lets you experiment a little bit earlier. And she was also the first Elementalist that I used on my initial Deity run, because I had not made anyone else an Elementalist along the way. And this is partially because of that class, but also partially because of the benefits that she gets from her own personal stuff. Laurai is one of my favorite mixed offense support mages. The fact that you get Ancestral Rage, so you're getting more power for the enemies that are within range of you, and have pretty decent defenses going on. Again, like, depending on what you're running her as, Fortitude might not be the best. That's definitely been the case for her as Juggernaut form, which I've also been trying. But she can get into the thick of it and live long enough to make use of that power boost. And then I love Empowering Edict. Just the ability to put some health on someone who's flagging a little bit, one of your tanks or something. And because they probably have a lot of HP and her mastery is not the best, it's not going to full heal, but then you give them a bunch of block. Very, very useful. And again, she's probably being used as a ranged class more likely than not, especially if you're running her in her base with Elementalist. You can walk up to your tank, heal them, give them some block, and then with her very good offensive stats, drop some big damage on the enemy as well. Like, she just clicked into place so well on my team as someone that could fulfill both roles, not be the best at either, but be a very good Swiss Army knife that I immediately fell in love. And then, you know, I made her in Spirit Seer and she started resurrecting people, and that went into a whole different combo. But that's a class discussion thing, not a Laurai discussion thing. But I think she's a very, very good option for sure.
So for me, Laurai screams Ritualist.
Ah,
she screams Ritualist.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair.
She has higher HP base growth than Cassandra does. It's 60% versus Cassandra's 40, so she's going to get like 100% HP growth in the Ritualist Hemomancer tree. She has ever so slightly higher might growth than Cassandra does, which is important for hitting. She has the same speed growth, which means she will double as consistently as Cassandra does.
I didn't realize that. Damn.
She has 10% better dex, so she's going to hit and crit about on the same level because Cassandra has better luck. And she has defense, which Cassandra doesn't have. She's got 30% as opposed to Cassandra's like 5% base or 10% base defense. So she is much tankier physically. Now, she has no fortitude, which seems to be a problem with the orcs. The orcs are weak to magic, apparently. But the Ritualist class patches that up a little bit. It gives her 25%. Or no, it doesn't. It gives her 10% maybe.
Let me see here. I have it on hand.
Ritualist.
Fortitude, 5%.
5%, and then it goes to 0 in Hemomancer. So never mind. She's going to fold to mages. But does that even matter if you're just constantly healing?
Well, and you have the HP, right? So you can take a big magic hit and then, yes, heal. So...
And the Hemomancer class adds on power for as much HP as you lose, and Ancestral Rage gives her even more power. And where we have Cassandra doing sort of the mana absorption, we have Laurai doing the larger DPS because she's getting that 8% power on top of her already high base power. Now, there's a little bit of drawback with that. The daggers are a little bit less strong than most other weapons, so you're getting a little bit reduction from that, but you're still getting a decent, like at least, I want to say maybe 4 power boost from her in the late game, 3 to 4.
Yeah.
It's not going to be that big, but it's useful because it's enemies within 2 tiles, and she's going to be 1-2 range. So this will be consistently always online as a little bit of extra damage. So I think if you like the Ritualist / Hemomancer playstyle, and you don't even have to go into Hemomancer with her, by the way, to utilize this, you can go Ritualist and then go into any of the other classes, and she'll be able to have that bleed, absorb, tank playstyle. You lose out on the extra additional power that the Hemomancer personal class skill gives you, but she can still execute relatively well with those growths, and you can go into one of the other tier 3 classes that maybe supplement one of her weaknesses more or make her even faster or whatever you really want to do with her. Just don't go into Dreadnought. But she will be very good. Like, she could even be a pseudo-tank Tidecaller if you really wanted to be.
Yeah.
And I think that makes Laurai quite special, honestly, because she's on the same level of Cassandra, but she has that, same level of utility. I think she's really, really strong.
I would agree.
And so I would want to almost put her on the same level as Eve or Mashal, or even just on the same level of Cassandra. I mean, Cassandra's got the same level of availability. They might be, honestly, almost the same unit, identically. One is stronger, one is more available. I don't know. What do you think? It's kind of a toss-up, but I do think she's in A tier.
I'm almost wondering if we put her at the bottom of S.
You think
You
so?
know? Well, because you think about it, and to me, obviously she joins much later than Cassandra does. And I've never really been a proponent of the join time argument, but I know there's definitely argument to that. But just looking at them side by side, she has a level of bulkiness and thus a level of consistency that, as you've been seeing with your Cassandra on Demonic, Cassandra does not a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you have so much durability with the Blood Mage Drain Tank build. And that you can combine it into things like extremely powerful Tidecaller in maybe a way that characters like Cassandra wouldn't really want to. I think there's a lot there. Maybe I'm hyping it up too much because I didn't think of the Ritualist Laurai thing until you brought it up, but that sounds absolutely phenomenal. I think that would be potentially one of the best ways to have a supporting character that can also hold their own. And we haven't had that in S tier yet. You
know what the defining feature is going to be. Can she self-cast Empowering Edict?
Let me double check. I don't remember if that's actually an ability that she can do.
With her ability enhancements, does it let her cast it on herself? Because if she can, I agree with you. Giving her self-block while also being able to do transfusion and solo on her own would be incredibly powerful.
She cannot. That is not an option. So that's a fair argument, I would say. Because, that would lend a level of sustainability and self-sufficiency that the other characters in S have that she won't have without that. So
I think she'll still be completely fine, but again, on the higher difficulties of Demonic where she's going to get chunked for damage, I think that extra block would be quite clutch. Now you can have a dedicated support unit to do that with her. That'll be fine.
But then that's where we get into the whole idea of only characters that can do it themselves have really been sitting in S tier. So
exactly. And so I think in that case, and she'll suffer from the same things that Cassandra suffers from, which is her speed won't be high enough to double most things late into the game. We'll keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And so I think she does go into that same, almost identical area to where Cassandra is.
I can take that argument. I personally might want to bump her up more just based on theory crafting, but I haven't used it, and I think that would make all the difference. So I think next to Cassandra is fine for now.
So are you arguing that the Spirit Bomb class is the one that would make the difference for her?
I mean, it certainly can be for sure. Just getting that extra bomb power because of her personal, that can really be nasty for the damage in a way that Cass just can't do. So I think Cass is a little bit more shoehorned than Laurai. Laurai has more versatility, I would say, while still being able to do pretty much everything that Cass does. So it definitely puts her higher than Cass in A, even if it doesn't hit her to S. I think if you had some issue with Cass, got bad growth, maybe didn't level her right, whatever, you could happily swap her out for Laurai and never look back. So
yeah, I agree. And so that's why I would just put her right here. Put them next to each other.
I'm totally fine with that. Absolutely.
We're definitely going to have to start readjusting our tiers. Do you want to do a little tier readjustment here?
Sure, we can do that. Absolutely.
Because it looks like our A tier is starting to get a little bit too big. And I'm almost in favor of cutting this right down the middle.
Really?
And bringing, Khamari, Valeria, and Gwyn down to B tier and taking all of these B tiers down to C tier.
Interesting.
And maybe even Benji to D. What do you think? Because, usually in a tier list, you would have some kind of, unless what you're going to tell me is these are all pretty even.
Well, and see, I would argue that they do. And now I get criticized for having top-heavy tier lists a lot. But I've always made the argument of okay, well, so that means that it's a game that has a lot of well-designed characters, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Nothing saying that it needs to be a different way. And while I think we can probably bump a couple things down, I think maybe Khamari on his own could go down to top of B, potentially. different little adjustments like that. All of the characters that we have in A feel like they hold their own in their own ways that makes them deserve that spot to me. As far as our B tier characters, I would say, if nothing else, Benji goes down to C, because we've talked about that a few times. I like him more than Aya. I also personally think that Zuhair should be down, but I get the idea of like the mobility and everything.
No, I can agree with that. I think he's better than Benji.
Yeah, I would agree with
maybe
that,
worse than these two, yeah.
But then Haoran and Riordan are definitely very solid middle-of-the-road characters that you're always happy to have, but that could also be swapped. For A tier, maybe you could bump Gwyn down to B, just from suffering from the warrior class tree and not being able to take advantage of Nightblade the way Valeria can. Have Valeria kind of be the gatekeeper of A seems reasonable.
I mean, you can still say that Gwyn is the gatekeeper of A because you need to be better than Gwyn to get to A.
I mean, that's true. You are absolutely correct about that. So yeah, maybe that feels a little bit better because I think like just the versatility and utility that all of our A tiers brings really can't be denied. And like we didn't talk about this because it's a class thing, but like Wreathed in Flame or whatever that Khamari can do so well, you just stack that over the course of a whole map and then just let a boss punch him in the face once and it explodes. Because it never falls off if you don't get attacked.
Yep, exactly.
And he can tank that hit from a boss. So that alone is like a boss kill option, I think makes him pretty high tier. So I think this is pretty good.
Yeah, I would agree. I like the readjustment a little bit more. Okay, so now that we've readjusted, let's talk about Tal'dera. And this is where sort of these last couple units in the game, to me, feel a little bit weird. Because they're such late recruits that by the time you get them, I've already got my units into their tier 3s at this point. Tal'dera comes at level 30, but she comes as a tier 2 to give you that flexibility to go into a different tier 2 and then, you know, decide what you want to do with her in tier 3, which I appreciate. Tal'dera's got some monster growths. 40% might, 40% dex, 40% luck, and a not too shabby 25% speed. Her base speed is already pretty high. And Tal'dera obviously gets the benefit of being in the Monk Ascendant class tree. So she can just go Monk and do that and be fine. For some reason, she comes as a conduit, even though her mastery is dog shit. It's like a 10% growth and it's pretty low, which is so confusing sometimes. Like they did that with Khamari and I'm kind of like scratching my head, and now they're doing it with Tal'dera and I'm like, this doesn't look right. But she can take Gale and make use of Gale pretty well because of the way the growths are distributed. And then her skill Magnum Opus makes use of crits, which Gale also wants to do for some of it. So you can do that. But then I think about, well, Monk and Ascendant is also a no-brainer, and she does that pretty well because she's got better might than Saxon. She's got the same speed as Saxon. She's got better dex than Saxon. She's got better luck than Saxon. So is she just better than Saxon at being an Ascendant? What do you think?
So Tal'dera, to me, of every character in the game, is just the ultimate stat stick character. I don't like her personal active ability at all, and I know last I saw you definitely share that opinion. Her passive is definitely solid, but if I'm comparing her and Saxon, I would take Call the Storm every time, just for that versatility of damage dealing. But if you just want to slap her into a good class and just have like a good stuff sort of build, she's definitely very, very good for that. So I like that you can just throw her in Ascendant, pop Divine Flow, and watch her pop off.
Yeah.
But I think she has less versatility for the overall team than someone like Saxon does because of his skills.
I disagree with you.
Really? Interesting.
Begrudgingly, because at the point where you get her, you're not going to be using Call the Storm with Saxon. What you're going to be using is Charged Key and Divine Flow, and that's going to be your bread and butter, and he's going to be mowing enemies down pretty consistently. Now, Call the Storm could be a nice little like patch up if you need it in the game, and yeah, Tal'dera's Steal the Stage sucks. It's terrible. It's really, really bad. And especially if you're going to go into the Ascendant class with her and use Charged Key, she's not going to need to reduce the speed of enemies. She'll already be outspeeding them by a lot. And stat-wise, she is the best Ascendant in the game, and she will absolutely self-sustain. So from all of the criteria we've been doing, unfortunately, as much as I hate to say it, she is S tier. Just by virtue of that alone. I mean, we've put Mashal pretty high up there because of what she can do, and Saxon has been up there from the beginning because of what he can do. And Tal'dera, unfortunately, does all of that. And I hate it. For some reason, I just hate it.
It's the hate that you have that's the most interesting thing to me, because I have no problem with it. Like, S tier absolutely works for me. I'm just surprised by the vitriol.
I can't put my finger on it. Maybe it's just because of the way she's like thrown into the story very in a weird way, and I'm sure that'll be expanded on in Dark Deity 3. That's a whole another conversation. But it just felt like she for no reason just power creeped my Saxon, who I've been working on the entire game until now, and then they're like, oh yeah, this unit's just better at doing this one thing that Saxon has been doing incredibly well the entire game. I felt cheated out of it in a way. It feels dirty. It feels dirty. Like, here's this level 30 bonkers character who you can just do Monk Ascendant immediately, and there you go. You break the game. I'm like, bro.
Well, perhaps I can expand your mind a little bit with this one, because you said something about Call the Storm that I heavily disagree with. So let me open you up to this one. So there's these nice little things we haven't really talked about too much. We've touched on a couple of times, called modifications to your abilities, right?
Yeah.
Upgrades that you can apply. And Divine Flow costs 100 mana, right? It makes you invincible for X amount of attacks.
Sure.
However, you can reduce that through ability upgrades. You can also reduce Call the Storm through ability upgrades. To the point that turn 1, you Divine Flow, move forward. Turn 2, you can jump into the middle of an enemy force, Call the Storm, and then dodge literally every attack that they throw at you, while Saxon clears an entire side of the map by himself. Now, can he do that on his own with Divine Flow? Potentially, but once Divine Flow runs out, especially on Demonic, you might be looking at some issues. But Call the Storm is direct damage that you can rely on, and will make it so that enemies survive, or are much less likely to survive, your counter punches once they start clapping at you on the enemy phase. So in a comparison between the two, especially if you want to throw in like a phase or something like that to really get Saxon into the thick of it, I think he has better overall clear potential than Tal'dera does, because he can take so much health off of the enemies, and you can actually have the mana to do it in a 1-2 punch on turn 1, turn 2. I think that gives him the edge over her, even if she has slightly better stats.
Okay. Counterpoint. Would you use Call the Storm over Charged Key? Because Charged Key is giving you that insane boost to all of your advanced stats. So you're getting that guaranteed extra power, you're getting that guaranteed extra speed, and you're getting that guaranteed extra crit, which does make a difference.
It does.
So I think they're honestly on even footing, and Charged Key lasts for 2, sometimes 3 turns.
That is true. The thing that I'm hung up on, I think, is the sheer power of direct damage abilities. Right? Like, there's a reason that, especially later in the game on Deity, and I'm sure it will be on Demonic, certain enemies will just directly cut the damage of direct damage abilities in half, because it is so powerful. So I value anything that is like a personal skill that does direct. So, but yes, the Charge Key argument is definitely a good argument. So having them on equal footing, I think, is fine. I personally think Saxon does have a little bit more overall utility, but I'd be happy to disagree on that as well, for sure.
No, I think he's better, and I would put her lower than him. She is an S tier unit. I just
no doubt.
Like, yeah, like we're not arguing her placement on the tier list here. I think Saxon, you have Saxon for 20 chapters. Yeah. His contribution is going to be immense, and I know you don't like the availability argument, but
I mean, it's a thing. It is a thing.
I get it. They're both S tiers, and we're arguing where they go in the S tier. And so from that perspective, like, yeah, Saxon's just going to be way better because he's been there for so long. Does she outstrip him from a stat perspective? If you go fixed growths, yes. If you're going random growths, Saxon might be way worse if he's getting screwed, and she's guaranteed stats, so she might actually end up being better. It's really a toss-up with how they grow and how they develop over the course of the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately... Right. She's an S tier, and I hate it.
Regardless of what our discussion is, we're both right compared to the guy in the Dark Deity Discord that said Saxon is actually Midson. So,
yeah, no, I will not accept that.
No, that is malarkey, good sir.
As soon as he goes into Monk, he's off the charts. Like,
oh yeah, no doubt,
unbelievable.
Now, someone that is kind of mid, though.
I don't even know if you can say mid.
Ooh.
Vissarion is down there with like Tusk and Aya for me, but I'll let you change my mind. Go for it.
I mean, I want to say mid because like Vissarion sounds fun, but I think you're just right. Like, I like him more than Aya because he can at least take a hit. kind of Benji tier in that regard. Potentially even better than Benji, more like a Zuhair, because he can at least give buffs to the rest of the team, and that's never a bad thing. But I was never really interested in using the guy, and it's a shame because he's a cool character and I like his design. But man, he really just is old man late game Fire Emblem recruit in spades. So yeah, he brings some unique utility to the table, which is nice. But at the end of the day, he's stuck in the warrior tree. He really only wants to be maybe. I mean, he could make a good seeker, because you would just have even more utility going on with accuracy boosts and putting vulnerable on stuff. But again, that's just a class utility thing. That's not because of him. Yeah, I'd say probably C tier below Zuhair. I like him more than Tusk. He can do more than Tusk, no doubt. But
honestly, I was gonna put him in D tier ahead of Tusk.
Really interesting.
Yeah,
below Aya and Benji.
Yeah, below Aya and Benji, because, I mean, look at his growths. His growths are kind of all over the place. He's got high HP and high defense, which is, like, suited for being a tank, but then he also has high mastery, so it's just like, what are we doing here?
That's
fair. Is he trying to go into champion and you make use of the champion nuke skills, which are also super mid, because they're very reliant on enemies being close together as well as allies being close to enemy? It's kind of weird, the champion, and we'll talk about champion in your class discussion when we get to that. But then his speed is super low, so he can't really make use of Devoted or Nightblade, because it just ends up being very middling. Yeah. It's like he doesn't really know what he wants to be in, but he wants to be in the tank class. And then you do have Seeker and Elisant, which I'll give you that. He can actually be a pretty good Elisant if you use full draw and just chip away from far away. He can do that relatively nicely, and with the high mastery scaling, he'll upkeep damage. But you have someone who can do that way better that joins very shortly after Vissarion joins. And you've already got all these wonderful units that he just doesn't have a place. I know people have mentioned using him as a buffer, and because of his firm resolve, his defense and fortitude increases, his HP decreases up to 30%. He just has ass fortitude.
Yeah.
In general. Yeah. So that's not going to help either. Like, he will fold to mage units too, so it's like he's only really benefiting from half of his personal skill. And then his personal ability command grants an ally 12 defense and fortitude. That's really nice. But is it worth giving up a unit slot to get that?
That's the big one. Yeah.
Like, I can see pairing him, this ability, with a Godfrost that is using their ability to get like 35 plus defense and fortitude and be a crazy tank buffer. I can see that. But at that point, you have to really be committed to that very, very niche segment that he can perform in. Okay, you know what? Because of that niche, I'm convinced I would be willing to put him into C tier.
And that's exactly what I'm thinking, right? Those buffs are nice, and he is the only one that can really apply that big defensive boost to anyone. And that is nice. That is definitely nice. Yeah. It's more useful than Benji, I'll tell you that much. Benji just heals himself. Woo!
I think I overlooked that ability a little bit. I think by virtue of that, the fact that it scales due to mastery and he has high mastery growth, I think if you just put him into whatever class has the highest mastery in that tree, just the command skill on its own buys him his way out of D tier.
Yeah, and I think Seeker and Elisant is the highest in that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Which then that synergizes with the other support things that you can do with that. So that's a solid role for him, but nothing higher than that for sure.
Okay, I've talked my way out of putting him in D tier. I think I feel okay about him a little bit now, because when I saw him initially, I was like, bro, what is this character? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, he's definitely like your rally bot for sure, no doubt.
Yeah.
And hey, that means we get to keep Tusk is indeed Tusk. He's the only one. He's going to be the only one. Let's go.
Yeah, he probably is going to be the only D tier, unfortunately, just because he's just so confused.
Poor buddy.
Yeah, he sucks.
Now, you know who doesn't suck, and I know we're going to have some divisive opinions on this one. It's my girl. Let's go. Ah, man. All right. I mean, I have my
Tell me about her.
But I don't know. I don't know if I should or if you should be the more level-headed argument, and then I come in with the steel chair.
let me open up with this, and some of this might be due to my own ignorance, but she is like last quarter of the game recruit, right? And when you compare her to someone like Tal'dera, you've gotten this absolutely bonkers unit followed by Vissarion, who's terrible, and then you get Calith, who seems to be somewhere in the middle. Her growths are all over the place. They're kind of like Gwyn's in a way, where they're balanced all round, but in a class that doesn't want them to be balanced. That mage class wants the high mastery, and she doesn't have it. She's only got 15% mastery. So the class she comes in, Geomancer, will prop that up, but it's nowhere near Arthur, right?
That's true.
And then her speed is very middling, so she's not going to double. Her defense and fortitude are pretty average, so using her as a warlock to prop those up to tank, not great, although she benefits from the might and speed. But again, her speed is middling, her might is average. Everything about her kind of screams average. And then there's this light absorption skill, where you increase defense and fortitude by 0.1. And I know you want to tell me, oh, well, she can go into Aegis and Relic Knight, but she's not as good as Alden at doing that because her growths are way lower. And this blind that she gets increases defense and fortitude by 0.1. So that means we need to have 10 stacks of blind for every one stat that we get. And if you're getting 3 enemies, and I'm sure this can be upgraded, but it's also within 2 tiles, so the most you're probably going to be getting is 3 enemies at one time. Maybe in fringe cases you'll get more. So I'll be generous and I'll give you 35 heavy blind stacks, giving you 100 heavy blind stacks within 2 tiles, giving you a 10 defense and fortitude increase. Her bases are pretty low. It's 16 and 15. Alden will outstrip that by the time you get him to where she is. She comes at level 32. By the time Alden's 32, I guarantee you he'll have 20s, if not more, in both stats. And so this is why she's confusing to me, because she feels like the epitome. You wanted to say mid-Vissarion? She feels like the epitome of average to me, but I'm open to having my mind changed. Tell me.
So, what you're saying is correct. Absolutely. She's not a damage dealer like Arthur is. She is not a dedicated tank like Alden is. What she does do, though, is a phenomenal off-tank debuffer role, the Mezzer role, if you will. So I'm actually in our little Discord chat. I'm going to send you something to look at as soon as Discord works with me and actually allows me to do this thing. Thank you, sir. So this is my endgame deity Calith build. Is it the most impressive thing statistically? No. And whether we have this on screen or just discuss it afterwards, whatever is fine. But what I found as a very good way to use light absorption and crystal refraction to your advantage was to make her a necromancer. Because while she doesn't have the best defensive growth in that regard, she does actually have a very good fortitude growth, and with the right rings, she can actually become quite dodgy as well. Now, we haven't really been talking about the application of rings to a lot of these different characters. Maybe we should have, maybe it doesn't matter, but I found that this build made it so she could be my front runner, run into a big group of enemies, blind everything, get very dodgy, get very defensive, and wind up really kind of doing a lot of damage to the enemy. Not necessarily killing anything, some stuff, because they're, can be a little bit weaker to magic most of the time, but set up a massive player phase turn where the rest of my team could run in and clean house. She's just tanky enough that she doesn't just explode. She's dodgy enough that she can dodge the first barrage of attacks, so she's not just getting obliterated. She's got good HP, so she can tank some hits when she does start getting hit. It is an all-rounder magic tank sort of build that relies a lot more on debuffs than something like Alden's out-and-out tanking. Now, that said, obviously if you're just trying to hold the front line, then something like Relic Knight Alden is going to be the way to go. But a lot of the time, especially in later maps, you have multiple different fronts that are opening up that you need to try and deal with. And that's where I found that Calith really, really shined as that second front kind of wall that could soften everything up and let the rest of the army really shine. She was my enabler for the last few maps that you have her for, and it felt phenomenal, especially with the Necromancer kicks. You can res, you can do other fun stuff like draining life to keep herself up, and since I took her through Geomancer, she could also heal, she could also Star Search people. She was just a utility piece, and to me, one of the better utility pieces in the game. But I know it's a weird build, so give me your thoughts, tear me apart, go for it.
I like the build, but again, I'm trying to get away from the concept of what the classes can do, right? Because any of the mages can do this combination. And so I'm really trying to look at light absorption and crystal refraction, sort of in a little bit of a tunnel, and see, do these two elevate her a lot in comparison to some of our A-tier characters, right? I'm considering B-tier for her right now as it stands.
Okay.
Because I do think she's better than our C-tier characters.
Definitely.
She's somewhere in the middle. But would it be enough to put her in the A tier? And I look at someone like Eve, like Mashal, like Zanele, Laurai, Cassandra, even Khamari, I think is an out-and-out tank, and being able to reflect damage back. He does fill that pseudo role that she does. He has that healing that she does. He'll have a little bit of the support that she does, and probably do some more damage than she does. Now, granted, she's 1-2 range, so that's something to consider. But if most of what you're doing is inflicting blind, and it's heavy blind, so it's actually pretty good, I just don't see her ascending up to the A tier, if that makes sense. Like, she can be a good unit, don't get me wrong, but I don't feel like she's a great unit with those two specific uniques just on their own, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, no, I hear you on that. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of those situations where you get into where it's like, how far can you really push the capabilities of like an all-rounder Swiss Army knife? And that's absolutely how I view her, right? Mm-hmm. Like, given the bases that she comes in with, and then the growths that you have in this like class combination, she has solid defense. She has slightly better and still solid fortitude. She's got good luck. She's got accuracy. She's got speed. She's got a bit of everything. But in a world where you maybe need to really push the boundaries in one particular direction, does she stand out enough? And from a pure stat standpoint, I would say no. But I feel like the ability that she has to really soften up an enemy front and be kind of hard to bring down so she can keep doing it for you in the future is important to consider. Now, again, how is this going to run on demonic? Is that also the only thing that we need to consider? No, but how is it going to run on demonic? I don't know. But having the level of dodginess that she has, having the ability to attack from 1-2 range, getting increased essentially dodge because she's blinding things, and then if she does get hit, having that ability to actually tank it a little bit more than you would expect, it has saved my bacon a lot of the time. Maybe that's a skill issue on my end, but I don't think she's S tier, certainly. And I don't think she's top of A tier. I think an argument would be made that she is more useful than Gwyn in a lot of ways to the overall team. And if Gwyn is our gatekeeper, I think that would put her bottom of A, personally.
Okay, well, I never used her. So I'm going purely off of sort of math and objective data, but you have the subjective data, and I will give you this one.
Okay, fair enough. And again, we can absolutely revisit her and dumpster her all the way down to D if she's terrible and demonic. But
I think you and I are going to have a very long partnership just by virtue of the way we think. I think we're somewhat of the same person in a way, which is kind of interesting. I've never found someone who like complements my thinking so much in like the way we talk about stuff. But you just have that differing level of perspective in a different way that you do things that makes things so interesting to bounce off you. So yes, I would love to follow this up with a demonic tier list once we're both done. Cool. And like have a rediscussion for these.
Absolutely. I'm 100% there with you. I think that'll be a fun time.
Okay. So we are reaching the very end of our list, and we have one more character who joins
himself
almost at the very end of the game, Big Daddy Irving. Now, I'm going to let you round this out. You let me go first on Calith. I want you to talk about Irving. Tell me what you think.
So, Irving is a very interesting character as he actually breaks the game in terms of the abilities that he's able to have, kind of. So, I would argue that Irving is the epitome of his role. I don't think that there's a better champion in the game, and I would argue that there's not much in the way of a better mixed tank and damage dealer for physical stuff specifically in the game. That said, Irving is still stuck in your warrior setup, so you have to work in that class tree, which is, I would say, the worst in the game. Not bad, but definitely the worst in the game. But, I mean, you get extra defense and fortitude every time you kill something. Like, you get unstoppable from Relic Knight. That's pretty good. You get the ability to buff up all of your allies' defense. That's pretty good. You get the Titanic True Speed -4, Power plus 25. That's pretty good. And when you've got the massive HP, might, and defense that Irving does have, combined with the overall pretty solid bases and everything else other than speed, which if you're keeping him in champion, he doesn't need anyway, he is going to be a mighty wall on the front that claps back really hard, especially if you want to pop in Command Wolf and just deal a ton of extra damage and soften up the enemy if you don't happen to kill them, which I don't believe will happen most of the time, but still, it's a nice bonus. I mean, I think the father surpasses the daughter, if nothing else. And that's before you even consider potential reclasses. Like, I think you kind of alluded to this before, so I don't want to steal your thunder, but I mean, Elisant Irving has some potential, man. It's got some potential. So you tell me what you think. I think he's absolutely A tier for sure, but where he falls there might be the discussion.
I think Irving is better Gwyn.
Yeah.
In every way. In terms of the way his growths are optimized, he doesn't have them evenly spread out across the board. He's got the low speed and the low dex with a high might and equal defense and fortitude being pretty good. He's got the relatively low mastery and decent luck and high HP. He is, like you said, the best a champion will ever be. And again, he's kneecapped by the class tree he's in. And so what I did with him is I just threw him immediately into Elisant. It was a no-brainer for me. I put him into Gallant to get that 5 extra power against full HP enemies, and then Elisant. And what I did was I full drawed, I put the Deep Song Greatbow on him to attack twice at 60% damage, and I was just letting rip from about 10 to 11 tiles away consistently. Every single time. Just like far away, I kept him next to my Lore Master. He would nuke with a little bit less mana use, get danced, nuke again. Easy. A unit halfway across the map is now dead, just instantly. And I know this is going to change a little bit on Demonic, because you're not going to be able to kill in 2 rounds. You'll need more. But then he gets the benefit of that class inflicting blind, right? Mm-hmm. I think the Elisant class does that.
Yep.
And so it's just going to be really good, because you're applying heavy blind stacks to enemies that aren't dying, and you're able to chip damage from really far away, and his growths are super well optimized, and he'll get like an extra 30% might and an extra 35% mastery from that class to even boost that power even more. So I think Irving is very good. I do think he's better than Gwyn, but where does he fall in A tier? He joins so late, and that class tree contribution is so average.
Yeah.
That I honestly don't even know if I want to put him in A. I might even just put him as the keeper of B tier.
You know what my argument is going to be here? Because I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I love the idea of holding the frontline champion Irving. I love the idea of masterful English longbowman Irving. I think because it's cruelly funny due to just like character interactions and story, Irving has to go in A tier just so he can continue to have Gwyn exist in his shadow.
No.
I think as future motivation for whatever sequels may come down the line, we need to, for Dark Deity 2, have Irving continue to be you must be this high to be the new master of the order type character to Gwyn. So I think bottom of A tier is the appropriate place for him. I do think he deserves it as well. Like I hadn't even thought about the idea of doubling up on attacks with the Great Bow through full draw. Like, oh my lord, that is like just the one-man human railgun. I love it. So I think that alone is a level of utility that he really has a lot going for him with. The only thing is that if you do that, then you miss out on some of his like unstoppable tank stuff. But even then, like he fills the role so well. So he's a phenomenal Elisant. He's a phenomenal champion. 2 out of 4 is pretty damn good when you're dealing with the warrior tree. I think that makes him A tier.
Yeah, and I think you can make an argument for Reaper Irving because his might is so high. So he can actually make use of some like sick one-shot builds with Reaper. So he's actually pretty good, honestly, now that I think about Reaper. Yeah, A tier would be good. I think he's actually better than Calith, though.
I think I'm fine with that. Absolutely. I think that's fine. I will let my bias for Calith, because I love her. If you want to talk about types, then I mean, I've got a type here with Calith. I will acknowledge my bias. The main reason she's in A is because I like her a whole lot, so she can be bottom of A. That's fine.
And I didn't use her, so I can't really counter-argue too much aside from the actual data.
Yeah, so. Which, I mean, data is important. We are in a data-focused genre, but also I hate looking at games that way, and I like the visceral fun of just getting in there and seeing what a unit can do. So,
I mean, at the end of the day, this is also a game that you play with a full team, right? You've got a squad of 10, Correct. And so every single person's play style and the way that they play the game is going to be different, and these units will change in the tier list based on how you utilize them. And so we've just given a little bit of an extra touch on it, on how we've used them and how we've viewed them, but that is certainly not the definitive be-all, end-all opinion.
No,
this is just sort of our thoughts. especially having not completed demonic completely yet. So
yeah, definitely.
Anyways, we are at the end of our tier list. I think you and I are about to go back to back and record another one that is even longer than the one we've just talked about. So
I think so.
What are your thoughts? How do you think we did?
I'm feeling pretty good. Looking at all these characters and where they've fallen, I think it lines up pretty well with my initial gut reaction towards most of them. I think, if anything, off the bat, I would have initially thought that we'd have Gwyn and Riordan a little bit higher than we do, but I think the arguments that we made as to why they are where they are quite sound. So I'm feeling pretty damn good about it. And I think having a stacked A tier is also fine because so many of the characters in DD2 are so good and are so versatile. And that's just a credit to the game's overall design. Mm-hmm. So I think that's fine. But what are your thoughts?
I'm personally glad that our S tier is just 4.
Yeah.
That's 25% of the cast, which is a decent amount, but it didn't get too bloated. I feel like we did a very good job of defining what makes meta characters, at least in our opinion. And I think we did a good job at that. I like my tier lists to be a little bit more evenly distributed, so I probably would have cut that A tier in half just by virtue of finding some kind of definitive line. But I agree with you. I think all of these are in some way, shape, or form almost on the same level that makes that difficult to do.
Yeah.
Without honestly getting into availability discussions, because once you do that, Irving and Calith fall off the end of that list.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we did very well. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, and I look forward to now further taking this context that we have and talking about classes in more in depth. I think that's going to be way more fun too.
Oh, I think it's going to be a great time, and I already have some ideas brewing, considering the fact that you look at our S tier, and our S tier characters are 2 mages and 2 adepts. So interesting implications there, to be sure. But
definitely. But yeah, thanks for joining me, and anyone who has gotten this far into the discussion, thank you for staying all the way until the end. Please make sure you go onto Titanium Legman's channel as well and watch his video that we are just about to make together, because if you enjoyed this conversation, this is going to be the same and more content, so you will enjoy that one as well.
We all know that content is king after all, so yes, thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope that you enjoyed the class video as well. For now, I will bow out and let Link King do his thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's all. I've made my outro, so you've done a great job at helping consolidate that. And so with that being said, thank you all for joining us on this journey through Dark Deity 2. There will be more videos to come, but until then, I will see you guys in another video very soon. Peace.